Outstanding. And Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you. Hello, hello. How are y'all doing? Y'all doing all right?
Doing great. My girlfriend Kate's in town, so I asked her to do that.
Magnificent. Well, thank you, Kate, for joining. It's such an honor. It's a pleasure and an honor to see you. You doing well today?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join this session.
Fantastic,
Okay.
fantastic. Well, thank you for being willing and joining. And Daniel, it is good to see you. And Michael, it is good to see you. And I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. And Kate, thank you again for joining. I would be curious what anyone is thinking about at all. But I'll throw it at Luber here. Mr. Luber, what's going on? How you doing, sir?
Well, first I have to say that I'm so happy to meet you. Uh, Jockin, I have to say your boyfriend is an amazing person. Uh, One of the smartest people I ever met and very, very patient thinker. And, I ask a lot of questions. I look up to him. He's great. So I'm like, I'm just so happy to meet you. It's awesome. I'll probably meet you soon. I go back east a decent bit, so that's what I wanted to say with that. But yeah, I was just thinking about uh, really thinking about limit. I guess this week, kind of in light of your conversation with Jockin and Ebert, because I think that's also at the center of it, like how we treat limit, how we understand limit. Like, so I said this to you off, you know, privately, both you and Jockin, where basically what's creating problems for the imaginative possibilities or how we treat the imagination register is that since science has taken a certain position in all of our lives, I can't believe in things like there's a dragon in the mountain and there's a gold that he's protecting or whatever. Like there's certain imaginary beliefs that I can't take seriously. Like I could take seriously in terms of like writing a story and art, but outside of art, I can't take that seriously anymore. But like, I don't know, a couple hundred years ago you can. And a couple hundred years ago also, because that was the case, it gave rise to the possibility of basically science progressing at a certain rate that um it seems like from like a physics like different, basically. I mean, it's a little different in biology with Michael Levin. There seems to be something going on there. But uh a coming of age novel, exactly. Basically, I'm thinking about how can we hold science and how can we hold basically fantasy and take both seriously. Um, and that at the center of that is limit. And basically, thinking about Ebert's theory, the interior and exterior, what about basically basically when one's absent on one side, it's present on the other. And it seems to be this very rigid, almost binary thing that's relation based. And I'm mirroring that with basically, it seems like I can't take it. There's a complete absence of, there's a dragon in the mountain in critical thinking, in serious thinking, where that needs to somehow be part of like serious thinking. And I'm wondering what qualifies this. Like what about thinking about ridiculous things like that and taking that seriously actually affects scientific progress? Like what about that exactly? And I'm thinking about, and like basically what about that? What about the relationship actually constitutes that? Because when I think about like time, like because limit has a relation to time, when I think about basically time, I think about how time is manipulated, but I don't necessarily think about why I have to think about time in that particular manipulation that way, which is typically based off of something that's completely other than that particular manipulation. So just to like parallel that, and then I'll pass it off. I have to think about science in this way and what's believable in a certain way based off of not taking seriously basically other ways. Like, what about that is the case? Why is that the case? And how do I actually bring those two closer together in thought and actually work with both? I have thoughts, but I've said a lot, and I'll pass it off, and I'll raise my hand again.
Well, first, everything that Luber said regarding Mr. Jockin Kate is true, so I second this strongly. And next, so there's a few questions, excellent thoughts, and then I'll pass it to Michael, Dimitri, and whoever wants to speak. So there's a few things. First, what does it mean to believe something and not to believe something? So there are many sociologists, like a Peter Berg, Philip Reef, and all the people I like to talk about all the time, who point out that our ability to believe something is actually socially tied together. Because it's not that necessarily, like the idea of there being a dragon in the mountain, technically that's not completely impossible, right? It just depends on how you define dragon. You know, is it the mythological, or maybe it's just more reptilian? I can imagine it as some sort of lost dinosaur or something, right? But the issue, so why is it that it just feels, it can't be true? Because it loses stickiness. Like sociologists will talk about a certain stickiness that beliefs have, more so than us proving it or not. And it's very difficult to believe something if everyone else around us doesn't believe it as well. It loses the ability to hold us, to compel action. Because the other question is, what does it mean to believe something? Well, one could say it has to compel action. If it doesn't compel action, maybe it's a notion, but it doesn't move into belief, right? So what happens? What are the pluses and minuses from having a society that struggles to have its action compelled by that which is more on the side of perhaps Charles Taylor's enchantment that he talks about in the secular age, fantasy, fiction, etc., so forth? What is the consequence? Well, many people might argue from a scientific standpoint, nothing at all. This is great. Fantastic. We don't lose anything, because actually all these fantasies do is make us irrational and get in the way of rationality, right? But of course, this begs the question of how does quote unquote knowledge advance? And Mr. Jockin has made the very important point that at some point, you know, for a long time, flight was fantasy. But because people were able to, well, imagine it and create art about it, that which was quote unquote impossible moved into it moved into that of which could occur. Right? And we've used language like hypothetical, probability, et cetera, so forth, right? The question is the following. If we're no longer able to believe in quote unquote dragons anymore, what sort of things like flight are cut off from us? Maybe nothing. But looking at history, it seems to be the case that if you lose enchantment, there are things you don't think to try to bring about, and therefore you missed out on nothing. Because that seems to be one of the problems, is a lack of imagination. Also can't imagine that it lacks imagination. So if there are new capacities that could be afforded because of dreams of flight, like that Eric Whitacre song, Leonardo's Flying Machine. Eric Whitacre's a good composer. I really like him. We used to sing him a lot in choir. But anyway, what's cut off, right? It's hard to say. Now, the question would then be the following. Well, maybe things are cut off, but the scientific method will make up for that anyway. Sure, maybe imagining flight or dragons or Star Wars incentivized quantifiable creation or invention. But, you know, science can do it too. And actually, it's a safer method, because when you go into fantasy, you end up in madness and so on and so forth. But this begs the question of how science works, of course. And, well, this is where I always like to bring in the very important Firebend's book Against Method, which nobody reads, because he's, you know, if you compare Kuhn, Firebend, and maybe Popper, and I know we've talked about those three before, there's the question of how does scientific invention come about? Well, I won't go through all of that, but Mr. Firebend makes an incredibly compelling case that the scientific method, science is compelled forward by mad people. People who are convinced of some sort of fantasy that they can't even prove, that they're going to fight for it, and he makes a case of Galileo, famously. Science doesn't advance by this kind of consensus of people looking at the data and gathering it. There's some madman who is completely bent on his theory about how everything works, and the church is against him, and the scientific community, and he's ravenous about it, and he fights for it, and even he'll fudge data that later turns out he was right even though he fudged the data. And so there's a radical subjective element that goes into the advancement of science, right? How much is fantasy enabling the subjective element without which you don't advance the scientific paradigm. Maybe a little, maybe a lot, but if there's evidence from the history, it could be a lot. And if that's the case, that could be a problem. How much do we need to believe in dragons in order to look out our window and imagine a man falling in a glass elevator and coming up with theories of general relativity? Because that's what Einstein was brilliant at. He could have thought experiments, right? He was able to see things like wonder, what does a clock tower look like at the speed of light, right? Like, do we need to believe in dragons to have those capacities? If so, then if we can't believe in dragons, we don't know that we've lost something. So it becomes an concealment. But let me give it to Michael and Dimitri here. Michael, it's good to see you on this beautiful day. You have the best background.
Oh, thank you. I might have the worst internet connection though, so hopefully,
Trade-offs, all trade-offs.
as soon as I walk outside, yeah, it starts to get worse. Yeah, this is great. I have a lot of thoughts on this. I I guess where I wanted to start is a quote from Chesterton that I love, where he said, "Fairy tales don't teach children that dragons exist. Children already know dragons exist. Fairy tales exist to teach children that dragons can be killed." And I really love that. I just finished this course on Shakespeare, and we read four of Shakespeare's plays, one from each genre. And we finished with The Tempest, which was my personal favorite out of the four. And the thing that I've just been struck by with that play in particular, but Shakespeare in general, is how much he relies on like spirits and angels and like seemingly very like pagan themes. Like especially in The Tempest, there's, you know, spirits, then there's magic, and there's like occult stuff going on. And you know, just thinking back to like that time, like pre-enlightenment, like how powerful those symbols were, those stories were, um, and how I think having magical elements, you know, fairy tale elements, things that like might not be quote unquote like real, um, actually made those stories incredibly interesting and complex and like stand the test of time. Like now we are, you know, 500 years later talking about like, was Prospero like a tyrant for using all of this magic, or was he like merely just, you know, putting people on trial, and like the ethics of um you know, exerting control, power, dominion, like all of those things. I don't think they would have been as effectively um conveyed, and I don't think we'd still be having the conversations we're having, debates we're having about Shakespeare, had it not been for things that like are um supernatural. I don't know. I think there's a lot of fiction writers who talk about sometimes fiction is actually more real than history, um, because it activates the imagination and it allows people like entrance into, you know, I mean, some people might say it's escapism from reality to read fiction. Like that's why some people are drawn to fantasy. But I I think the like the serious readers of fiction and fantasy, like they read it because there's something more real about it, than sometimes, you know, what we see in our reality. And you know, John Vervaeke talks about like the imaginal different from the imagination, like the imaginal being something that you're actually taking up a role and you're actually enacting. So like he uses the example of like the little boy who puts on the Superman cape and like pretends to be Superman and embodies not just like the actions of Superman, but like the temperament, the persona, the, you know, the thinking. And I think when we read things that, you know, to invoke uh, the language Luber was using, like that go beyond our scientific rational limits, um, it causes us to transcend ourselves, and it causes us to think differently, and to imagine what it would be like to be Prospero creating a storm, out of, you know, revenge, but then also at the end in the epilogue, like writing this beautiful speech about how he's going to relinquish all of that power because he doesn't need it anymore and he's going to return to being a human. And so I think there's something about fantasy that it's almost like it takes like the human condition and it kind of turns it up to like 12. It's like, let's make the stakes like crazy and let's like give power and yeah, power and magic that like we may want or desire or have, but like have in a much more diminished form, and then see how that plays out, like see the choices that people make. And so I think, yeah, I think fantasy is like an indispensable part of like ethics training, honestly. And to to throw it back to like Jockin, like exposure to beauty. I think ultimately. So yeah, those are just some jumbling thoughts, but I'll
No,
pass
not
it
at
back.
all. Magnificent. And the flowers are beautiful. I grew up like never realizing morning glories were weeds because those remind me of morning glories, even if they're not. And when I was told that, that was the beginning of thinking because I realized weed was an arbitrary category and what else could be it woke me up from my dogmatic slumber. So anyway, what you were saying is quite lovely and very, very important. So, and then I'll give it to Dimitri here. There's something about fantasy that makes texture. A speaker or a thinker that lacks, say, allusions to literature, or lacks metaphor, or lacks analogy. It lacks a certain texture, and it almost feels weirdly less like thought. Like if you listen to a thinker that makes no incorporations of what is fiction, it's weird. It almost feels less true because it does not incorporate more fiction. This is very odd. A few more things. Shelby Foote, who I really, he was a historian and he would reference, he attributed to Keats, the poet. He said, and we've said it before, a fact is not a truth until you love it. And Shelby Foote was of the opinion that history, in not being written like literature, was making it so that people didn't love literature, didn't love history, therefore it wasn't a truth, therefore they repeated the mistakes of history. So there's an odd thing where Shelby Foote was suggesting that the incorporation of the skills of fiction, and I know distinctions can be made here between fiction and fantasy, et cetera, so forth. But I only bring it up because many people accuse, Shelby Foote of therefore making fiction, fantasy, that which is not real versus history. But he's like, but if you don't actually use these tools, then no one will learn history because they will not be able to see themselves in it. Because it is in a story that you see yourself in, history will repeat. So this is very interesting. Shelby Foote was like, you actually have to run the risk of falsity if there's any hope of truth. This is basically the suggestion. If you don't run the risk of falsity, there is no truth. So there's also something to be said that if you don't run the risk of believing dragons, you don't even get science. That's almost what is suggested. If there's no risk of believing in dragons, you lose science as well. If there's no possibility of believing in fantasy or that which does not exist, then you lose facts. You lose actual, just concrete information. And this is very odd, but it seems to actually be the case that you have to have a risk of error. And I am glitching out, but there has to be some sort of risk of error if there's actually even going to be something like truth. Like that risk has to be there. And this is very interesting. And the question becomes kind of like, why? Why do those things seem to go together in such a deep manner? Well, some things come to mind. And why does it seem like a thinker needs to incorporate art or et cetera, so forth, or there's a lack of texture, or there's a lack of an ability to actually take what they're saying? And why is it that great literature seems to have some incorporations of fantasy? Well, something that is coming to mind as we're speaking is, and we've spoken many times about analogical reasoning, and Mr. Jockin is very skilled on this topic, and I think the analogy is very important. What's very interesting is that even if something is fantasy, you can actually still apprehend a meaningful analogical principle in a fantasy. You can get real analogical knowledge from fantasy. You can make an analogy out of Tolkien. You can see an analogy being a logical principle that helps another phenomenon unfold. And it's kind of interesting because it's almost as if we need fantasy because we find ourselves confronted eventually by things in reality that to grasp require an analogical insight that is not yet given to us in our immediacy or lived experience. but we need it all the same to make the point we need to make right now. And it's almost as if the limit, because there's something interesting about limit here. Like, the limit is the need for this analogical principle that we have not been given to us in our immediacy, that if we can apprehend it, can actually help us cross that limit. Like, we need something on the other side of the limit that we don't have to transcend it. And the limit is actual experience. We haven't actually experienced Lord of the Rings, for example. But but we nevertheless need the analogical insight that the fiction can provide, that is limited from us in not being possible in experience. But in apprehending it across the limit, per se, through imagination, you now can change the behavior of the actual in a manner to actually make it move beyond that limit, per se, or being limited from not having the analogical principle that you can now grasp from the fiction, right? So there's something very interesting here where it's almost what ends up happening. I think we do see this, and I'll give it to Dmitry, Luber, Wynn, and then Mr. Jockin. I think we see that science that ignores fantasy becomes weak in analogical judgment. It becomes weak in analogy. And if analogy is the highest form of human thinking, this is a problem. And maybe that's because fantasy creates incentive to think analogically, because you know it's not factual. So the question is, what good is it? What are we doing when we read Shakespeare? What are we doing when we read Tolkien? Well, you're getting analogical principles. That's what you're doing, which then, of course, are mysterious. And that very mysteriousness then gives incentive to continue training and learning. That's something I'm thinking live, but I will give it to Dmitry here. Dmitry, I certainly enjoyed speaking with you the other day. Thank you for your time. It was a treat, sir. Dmitry.
Yeah, this is a really cool conversation. I really love literature. The last few months I've been diving into English language literature, Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, Herman Melville, Joseph Conrad, others, and Shakespeare too, Hamlet, of course. What else? Yeah, I really think that when you do literary history or you read novels from certain centuries, you really come to intimately know how it was to really be a subject in that epoch. And that doesn't really matter how fictitious the novel is or not. But yeah, there is something radical about being able to cross the limit and to set yourself aside and let the story use you to write itself, but still having it be autobiographical. And so I think an exemplary case of this is Kafka. With Kafka always did this. He was always writing about, whether it was Joseph K. or Metamorphosis or what have you, or the Starving Dog. Like, he was always writing about himself in a fictitious setting. So he self-externalizes himself. And Edgar Allan Poe also really did this. You can see this, especially I've read his not his complete works, because he also wrote some less significant things, but I read his selected works, so it's all the important stuff. And in that one, you can see that he keeps returning to certain themes, certain motives. One of them is oh God, it's so painful. It's that the motive that reoccurs again and again is that you find your perfect lover. Let's say if you're a man, the perfect woman, you find her. It goes right. It doesn't even go right. It goes even better than you could have ever imagined and ever hoped for. And then she gets sick and dies. And then you get together with someone else who you already know is actually but a substitute for that prior woman. So, of course, this is a theme that I hope we're all acquainted with. It gets to something very much at the heart of the tragic nature of love and sex, being a sexed being, sexual being. And this recurs again and again in Poe, and in a way, it's so beautiful, and it really shocks you when you read it. And he's writing it about himself. Let's be honest. So another one, and I have to do this, guys. I have to do this because I never I don't really get to talk about this type of stuff, but it's actually constantly reverberating in my mind. And if I would say what's the best novel ever for eternity, I would say it's this one. This is the immortal novel. It's really the best one ever. In Dutch it's called a total roman, which is like a total novel. It's kind of Hegel, but then literature. So if you think Herman Melville did like an amazing job with his encyclopedic knowledge about whales, well, wait till you read Harry Mulisch and the Discovery of the Heaven, and then the rest of his works, which are also great. He was really, he was. So he comes from a background. His father, I believe it was his father was an Austro-Hungarian. His mother was a Jew, but his father wasn't. I believe he was Czech actually. So he was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire for a while. But then, of course, Freud and Kafka are also like this, Jewish Austro-Hungarian. So he's the perfect fucked up subjectivity because he lived through World War II, being half Jewish. His father was actually a Nazi. He worked together with Nazis. So you get this crazy person coming out of that. And and like, why am I mentioning it? Is it just my own interest? No, this is really has objective consequences for world history, guys. Because what he does stylistically with literature, he has more novels that are also really good, but is really combine. I would say there's tons of ways to put it: the singular and the universal, or you could also put it in a more literary way, in that he combines fiction and autobiography, and that's really the genius move that he does so well. And I actually think that so one of the ways that I'm not a novelist, I'm not a fiction writer. That doesn't mean I don't like to write it. I do like to write fiction. Actually, I think it's super important to also write fiction yourself to really get to another level. Like, just between me and you guys, like, I think people who just read literature and don't write it themselves, I think they're missing out big time. They should write it too. Doesn't matter if they shouldn't necessarily share it with others, but do this process, go through this process, and you will read in a totally different way. So yeah, that's that. So, but okay, so I love literature, but I am a philosopher, and ultimately I'm bound up with philosophy. This is my fate, my destiny, my obsession, my passion. But it's also autobiographical. It's also autobiographical. If I look to what I've been doing philosophically, usually it goes like this. There's a certain notion I'll get obsessed about, and I'll be like, this is the absolute notion. Like, everything is about this, everything I care about is in this, and this is really the way in which we can view our world. Then, of course, after a while, it all collapses, and I'm left with the vacuity of it all. But fortunately for me, it's all about the becoming of this type of stuff. So I'll get some other thing I'll be fixated on. I'll try to unfold, develop, and change in my thought. But if I look back at my papers, my articles, there's an autobiographical current, and it's really like, in a way, it's even beyond truth and fiction. It's like it's the truth of the fiction that informs how we can even conceive of truth apart from fiction. And so here I want to also respond to Luber and hopefully be a bit more philosophically rigorous instead of just spouting all of this. So Luber, the word critique, Kant was very much a fan of this word, critique of everything, pure reason, judgment. So critique, for Kant, it's not like you just lash out at something. It's not like, I don't like this, that's for I am saying critique of this. No, for Kant, critique is more about the etymological root of the word, which is in Greek, I believe it was something like krinain, So don't kill me on the pronunciation of ancient Greek. But then it means something like to separate or decide. So to do a critique of something is to perform the art of judgment upon something. That's a way you can understand it. And so the art of judgment, to separate, to decide, you can already see that critique is all about limit. It's all about seeing where are the boundaries, where does it begin, where does it stop, how should it be compartmentalized, what is not the task of a given edifice. And so here, if we read Kant and stuff like this, and to talk about limit, there's a super mega crucial distinction between limit and limitation, which I really love because it makes all the difference in the world. So a limit, bear with me. So a limit is something that you don't know that it is a limit. It's just something that you can't access, right? Like, let's say the limit of your vision. Like, you don't really know where your vision ends. It's not like you can clearly demarcate the boundary. Of course, you see a certain thing and it's bound, but then there's no limit in that sense. It just stops. It's very weird, right? So that's limit. But then there's also limitation. And so limitation is a limit that has become immanent. So you can demarcate it. It's like the boundaries, or like how do you say it? The boundaries of like a country or something. It's like, here is the line. And so this difference between limit and limitation, what should we do with it? I think one of the ways to read Hegel's dialectical method is that it turns things that are limits into limitations. So instead of it determining you and you don't even know about it, you bump up against the limit, you come up against the contradictions, and then at a certain point you overcome the limit and thereby make it into a limitation. And that's the mischievous little dialectical trick. That limitation, to make a limitation, one already has to go beyond it, right? Like, one already has to know, okay, but what is delineated by this limitation? And so a limit is not this. A limit, you are not beyond the limit, therefore you can delineate it, you can demarcate it. But a limitation is such an entity which you can delineate, and therefore it becomes immanent. Now, so I also want to say one more thing, because I'm curious how you guys think about this. So we all reread ancient stuff, Plato, Aristotle, Dante and stuff. And Cadell recently brought it up that Zizek says that whenever we read pre-modern sources, Zizek says something with us, like we feel that we can't just mimic this, we can't just copy this, we can't just do this as they did it before. And so I think Plato is our contemporary, if anyone of that epoch is in contemporary. Aristotle, I think less so. we can discuss that. But I think I felt this when I read Dante, that, I love Dante, of course I do, but there's things in Dante like we can't do it like that. It's also not desirable to do it like he did, right? Because it's like, is Dante theology or literature? Well, it's both. Like, let's be honest. It's like the distinction in a way is at least muddled, at least. Not to end the conversation, but to start it. Like, how do we even do that? So, but today I feel like this when I read Mulisch, or like, let me put it like this: when I read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I'm like, wow, that's a contemporary. When I read Herman Melville, it was different. Actually, I thought Edgar Allan Poe is also our contemporary, but Herman Melville, I feel like some bits are like, wow, that's like, you could have written this today, and other bits I'm like, oh yeah, like we can't really do that like he did anymore. And so I think when I read Mulisch, I become ecstatic because he's like me. Like, I'm like seeing myself in it all the time. So thanks for listening.
No, magnificent. I'll give it to Luber and then Jockin, just a few things quickly. I really like this idea of limit versus limitation. That is lovely. It is making me think that there is something about fantasy that is actually making us move limits to limitation. Because there's something about the only thing we imagine is that which science fails to provide. Like there's a way in which we can view fantasies as arising because something is not being met, right? Something is not there. Well, therefore, fantasy is unveiling, maybe discreetly or in a difficult to tell way, a limit. It's making a limit appear as a limitation, but you have to learn how to think the fantasy. But of course, thinking the fantasy would move into analogical reasoning about it. We'd have to see the principles of logic that are not being put forth or what is not being addressed, right? And there's something about literature that gets into everything, such as the ability to train empathy, libido, beauty, all of these things that are being missed out, that we're lacking principles to approach these things, that if we do not, there's trouble. Well, this is where then maybe there's incentive for science to say, well, fantasy is just fake. There's no truth to it. There's nothing there, because then there's no limitations to science. Whatever the limits are, just stay limits. It's never a limitation, and therefore it takes over, and there's a totalizing vision, right? So the othering of the humanities may contribute to an inability to see the limitations of science, which, if those limitations are dire, could be dire. And of course, the beginning of real speculations, as you pointed out in your article, is pointing about the necessity to move from reason with Dawkins to the spirit, the Harris, and then Peterson religion, and thinking the issue of absolute knowing, beauty, etc., so forth, right? There are some dire issues. I am just very quickly very interested. Many people understand that literature teaches empathy. Is empathy on the road to learning analogy, analogical reasoning? Like there's something about empathy that seems to be on the path to learning how to do analogy, but there's a kind of higher principle there. And the other thing I'm thinking about on that idea, yeah, you can't write Dante. You can't write Dostoevsky. Like David Foster Wallace talks about this, how when you look at, say, a Russian novel, they're talking about God all the time in Dostoevsky. That's just not, here's the issue. The plausibility structure of the society does not allow that kind of writing anymore, even though the plausibility structure of Russia at the time allowed that kind of writing, right? And so the idea of, oh, you need to be realistic in fiction. Well, what is realistic moves. It moves relative to the age, right? I agree Plato is a contemporary because that's kind of dialogue structure, and the concerns of Plato are what we need to be thinking now, right? But different philosophers at different times have different interests, and also there are different styles, right? Like, for example, for me, you mentioned Dante. A religious literature now is going to have to look something more like a Flannery O'Connor or Mary Robinson in Gilead. It's going to actually have a different structure that goes about. And actually, what I would say, it has to be more apophatic. It has to walk around the crater, like maybe even a Walker Percy, without any pouring in from the top. The structure, the style has to work in different ways, because also when Dante is writing, where he is writing, Christianity is quote unquote given. So there's no pouring in from the top. This is just reality, right? But if you were to write not of Dante today, it would feel like propaganda because you're pouring it in from the top. So the sociological structure changes what is tenable or not. And then knowing Dante was reading in a different period can make it tenable versus not. But then here's the issue. What do we gain from reading old literature then? Well, we're probably looking for various analytical principles. I have more to say on this analogical thing because I'm thinking about that a lot as we're talking. And there is something also where, isn't it interesting that you read some literature and learn about yourself? That's really weird. Like, why did you have to read this novel to learn something about yourself? It's almost as if there is analogical principles that you need for yourself that you can't learn from yourself directly. It has to be indirectly, which would make sense because analogy is other as the same, right? It is that ability to see a logical form that is in operation that then gives it a certain objectivity because it's not just in you, it is also present in something else, which then makes it have a universal quality that you are participating in. To the question of that you were asking there, Mr. Jockin will correct me when I'm wrong. But on the notion of, you can look at sort of a metaphor as if I were to say that person is running like a cheetah. There is something like the analogy in the metaphor, but technically the analogy is more so a description of a logical unfolding that helps you understand another logical unfolding. So if I were to say, for example, the development of philosophy, I go into great detail more so on how philosophy, if I say to you, philosophy, and this is going to sound like a metaphor, is like an embryo developing, right? Well, I'm not just giving you an image. I'm actually giving you an entire logic of unfolding that philosophy goes through, right? There's a certain development that occurs, there's a transformation that happens, there's different stages. I'm giving you a principle by which to carry yourself as you go through philosophy. I'm not just giving you a description to understand the frame. I'm giving you a model of operation, right? Now, more can be said, but that principle is what's very interesting. We basically, in my opinion, go about our lives looking for analogies by which to have logical principles to understand how things unfold before they unfold, because then it's too late and you can't go back in time. Like, you're always looking for that logic of unfolding. I will pause and give it to Mr. Luber and then Mr. Jockin. Mr. Luber, please.
I was just thinking, how lucky I am right now that I'm not doing other shit while trying to do this, and I can like sit down and take notes, and like how I'm able to like have my thoughts better because of that. And then right when I'm thinking that, the ironic thing happens, and Daniel just says a bunch of bam, 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 and I'm like, fuck, I can't type this fast, and now I'm kind of all over the place in my head. So thanks, Daniel. I guess where I'll start is this idea of like literature, writing, doing the act. I would say like my idea of an ultimate thinker, which I'm definitely not, because like there's things that I just don't do when I'm about to lay out. So it's like the thinker to the max is someone that literally like translates the original into their own. Then from there, I'm just like thinking out loud with this, but then from there, they're able to write a story from the philosophy. And then from there, they're actually able to make experiments about the world that they're in and actually have an idea about a real world application in that experiment. Like that line right there. Like if someone can do all that, I think we're going to be able to like have some crazy shit, honestly. That's kind of armchair philosophy shit. Now onto like, so I'm going to start like backwards, Daniel, with what you were saying, like with the givens, with that, because everything you're just talking about, basically analogy just being like very particularly within a story, you start in a certain state and you end in a different state, and those states are different, and yet the state that's different, that is the resolute state, is present in that expositional beginning state. And sorry, I was getting a call. And basically, in the act of actually even telling a story, so analogy gets doubled. There's analogy within the story itself, which is being able to have both states that are different exist within the same story. That's a certain kind of analogy. That analogy I wrote, that was like what my book that I'm right on theme was basically about. Then there's another analogy, which is what structures that analogy. There's like a double analogy. So this is like the second analogy to me. And this is where it gets more into like religion and basically the analogy in which you understand yourself. Then from there, you apply that analogy in which you understand yourself into the analogy of the particular story that you're writing. So with that said, when we read past literature or past philosophers even, it's basically different givens, but we're trying to understand the analogical application of that particular moment in time. And the hope is, to me, that it reveals something that sheds light on the possible analogical application of the moment in time in which we're living in currently. That's the idea that I think the purpose of going back in time and looking at literature and even philosophy. So I wanted to say that. And then just a quick note on the thinking analogical in terms of just the creative act, because I think all creative acts in themselves, like in just that act, has two different states that are both together at the same time. And what controls that is basically theme, in the sense that theme deals with the mode and manner in which a logic comes forth, or in which an unfolding of how these two different things are able to exist in the same container. So I just wanted to say that. And then with regard to what you were saying, Dimitri, I really took to the limit and limitation. I really like that too. I like the movement that you're drawing out here. I would say, just to think of the little Lacanian here, it's the difference is limitation has real constraints, limit has imaginary constraints. That's, I would say, that's the difference. The idea is, how do we basically move the imaginary constraints such that we have a different relationship to the real constraints, which is the different limitations based off of how limit, from an imaginary standpoint, reveals itself to us. I think basically, in order to do that, we have to kind of going back to the ultimate thinker idea, we have to be able to have a certain play with the imaginary constraint, which to me is the act, not just reading, like you were saying, or watching, but actually doing yourself, making your own imagination, if you will, your own imaginal unfolding, a story, and then playing with those constraints such that you can actually then go to the real world, the experiment, and actually do experiments and manipulate in a certain sense, not in like the bad sense, manipulate the real world constraints such that you can get a different result, a good result, if you just grant me that language. So with that being said, critiquing, yeah, she might be. I fuck with her so much. She could be. Just to that comment, Dimitri. But the critique being the art of judgment is basically like is completely isomorphic, and I think that like Kant, I think he can be bad. I've learned to accept him as bad in certain ways, thanks Jockin, but there's something about his focus on judgment on that third book that I always gravitate to. And I just think there's something in that third book. I'm gonna pass it off, but I said enough.
Outstanding, and I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. Well, just as a quick note to what Dimitri was saying, I am of the opinion that the act of making art, making literature, like design, etc. So there is something about, if you don't have what I would call the phenomenology of the artist, there is something you dramatically miss out on. And I'm actually not sure if you're going to be able to experience. Philosophy starts in wonder, as it famously goes. Now, what exactly that means, there's a lot of different things. I think in the creative act, thinking becomes strange again. Like, you are reintroduced to the strangeness of thinking, the ability to have a movie in your head and there's nothing there, to just kind of sense the next word. There's a sudden mystery that comes out to you that I do wonder how much philosophy can do without being acquainted with that phenomenology of the artist. And it comes to mind, Mr. Jacob Kashir, good to see you. He's been doing magnificent work on hip-hop, cipher, At the Portal, Cadell, etc., so forth. And I've always associated the mystery of the cipher as also a phenomenology of the artist. Where do these ideas come from? Where do they emerge? There's a certain experience of that miracle of creativity that actually seems incredibly necessary to think. As you were speaking, I also was having the point, like, again, the difference between, and again, Mr. Jockin, please correct me, on analogy versus metaphor. There's also something here, I'm thinking about your work on theme, just what you were saying, where analogy has theme, where metaphor does not. If I say this person is a cheetah, that she's running like a cheetah, it's a metaphor because it's using to describe a single quality. Okay, she's like a cheetah, but she's not like a cheetah in any other way. It's not like she has fur or something. I'm trying to describe speed, right? This doesn't have a theme. But if I say philosophy is an embryo, I mean that in many, you got to feed it or die, you got to give it energy. You have to hold it. It has to grow. It gets a life of its own. Like, it's not just a single description I'm getting at. There's an entire unfolding that can be brought out, right? And the more you think about it and the more you return to it, the more it changes. Like great novels are analogous because when you read them at 20, you get a different understanding than at 40, at 60. There's transformation. You really should read great novels every 10 years or 20 years, right? And I think actually, honestly, when you get to about 40, you should focus on rereading. You've kind of, after you get the scope of the great works, you should really focus on rereading to get the incredible revelation of this analogical principle that is unfolding. And the repetition is also uniquely positioned to unveil the difference between metaphor and analogy. Because when I say she runs like a cheetah, and then 10 years from now says she runs like a cheetah, nothing really changes. But when you're dealing with philosophies like an embryo, when I say it when you're 20, and then when I say it with 40, it hits you entirely differently. Like when you're 20, you're like, oh, that sounds cool. But when you're 40, you're like, yeah, it really is. It grows, it develops, it becomes something you don't expect. That sort of ability of shock, of change is also critical. It is very interesting to think, I would have to expand on it, if the analogy, what makes something an analogy is theme. And theme is the movement to an analogous understanding, and that the analogy unveils the theme. So perhaps the difference between metaphor and analogy is theme, could be something. But I will pause and give it to the wonderful and legendary Mr. Thomas Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Good to see everybody. And Luber, that was very kind of you. Your opening statements, very sweet. And I'm glad that Kate's here. It's really fun to get to share. So on the note on analogy, right, metaphor, there's a very important actually element about this. So what you're pointing out is that metaphors require knowledge by experience of the topics being discussed. So it's actually bounded. It's a bounded knowledge. Meaning, a common example used by Cadogan talking about metaphor, is a smiling meadow. The only way that it can make any sense, I'm using that purposely because not many people understand that metaphor. But that draws the point out is that you have to know both in terms of what smiling means, what a meadow means, and then what would it even signify for a meadow to smile. And because it's not as opposed to it run like a cheetah, we all understand that. It's in our culture. So metaphors are very culture bounded. And in fact, actually a lot of these are, even analogy too. But there's a cultural bounded materialness about the intelligibility of the concept of what's being communicated. Typically, there's a two-turn mode of metaphor. It's typically, and it's usually it's full analogy by attribution. Use Cadogan's classification about it. So that's what you're picking out when you're seeing a certain picking out an attribute. Now, what proportionate analogy gives you, it's usually a 4-term pair as opposed to a 2-term pair, and it reveals a 5th concept. The point is that all metaphysical concepts are analogical for exactly this reason. So what I mean by that is, and I'll use the example from my health course coming up. The concept of health is analogical because what it means to be healthy for your bloodstream, for your blood pressure, for example, is not the same as your lungs. Yet we say there's healthiness in both when they're in a certain dispositional state, et cetera, et cetera. But how's that possible? They're both different things. They're both different material. They do different functions. They have different requirements. None of these are alike, exactly. Yet in the relationship, for example, actually, and this very much particularly by quantification, like your blood pressure, for example, has to be a certain rest state and motion state. And in that rest and motion state quantified gives a presentation of what it means to be healthy. And likewise for your lungs, in terms of your basic lung capacity, same exact thing. So the fact of actually, if you look at particularly the lung capacity activity and the blood pressure activity, how do you get health? The only way health makes sense is by looking at the relationship. It's actually not the particulars, it's the relationship. And it's actually via that mode you get health as an analogical term. This is also similarly what health with goodness is. Goodness, truth, beauty, all the transcendentals. Any metaphysical concept requires this mode of analogy because it's a 4-term pairing that reveals a 5th, that reveals itself, a leaping. I like that language of leaping, that leaps forth a new reality that was always there but not seen. And I would, Daniel, your comment, by the way, that Luber's work in theme is analogical reason. That's exactly what it is. I'm not surprised Luber's very keen and interested on these topics because that's basically what Luber's doing. It's a 21st century version of analogical reasoning. And I think actually I want to share some notes, because Daniel, your comment to this idea of that how can a pairing of 4 terms reveal a 5th that's unspoken for, which there's other examples that I can point to, as empathy, that is really interesting. And I say that because metaphor requires experience within a cultural boundedness to understand the meaning. And an analytical reasoning does not necessarily require that. So it's just beyond experience. I say this because I'm reading, there's a note in Meno, called the Meno paradox, where they're going through trying to investigate what virtue is. And they're at a pause. They don't know what virtue is. And then Meno turns around to Socrates and goes, hey, how are we going to find this thing you're claiming you don't know? You don't know what this is. How are you going to find it? And even if in their search you did look for it, how would you even know you got it? It's the question of the search, right? What's the object of the search? And even if you could get it by accident, how would you even know? This is a very significant problem for Plato. He's presenting to us at this point. What's really interesting is in the discussion, so then actually this demonstration of the slave boy with the learning of geometry, that episode happens, but what's relevant is to say the space of doxa, that in the space of doxa, via the operation of repeated questioning, by repeated questioning, they are in a dream state, that through the activity of questioning, repetition of it, they are awakened. Language is awakened with knowledge, with episteme, as an awakening. And then I'm going to remind a little bit Timaeus, I'm going to overlap a little bit Timaeus on this, by distinctions, which we use names for to do this. So so I'm bringing this up in the sense of the kind of operation of logos with mythos. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to awaken. And then actually the kind of episteme process, analogical reasoning should allow her a revealing, this leaping quality I talked about, this 5th term that shows up magically, is this awakening by drawing out the movement of the distinctions, right? Through their, and as your brother pointed out, they're correct, yet very curiously, analogical reasoning allows for both the movement of the similar and the different at exactly the same time. It's quite fascinating. It's also another example, by the way, and it's not like Aristotle didn't have this. Aristotle allows for what's called analogical causes. So he allows for this operation to be discussed and investigated. And I also see this because Aristotle even uses this concept of awakening as knowledge to discuss anageia. He does not give a definition, that's something too. So if you go, you don't have to give definitions over time to point to reality. That's actually a very important element here, because he actually uses this point that he doesn't actually give you a definition of anageia, nor Damascus. He just gives you a depiction by showing, he actually demonstrates it in Metaphysics 9's whole point. To be awakened is to being asleep, is anageia to Damascus, for example. He's actually demonstrating it to you. So I think and I'm bringing all this up because it's kind of the difference of I call this kind of the play of suspicion disbelief, because what Plato actually closes on at Meno when he gives his presentation, and he doesn't have full confidence in it, by the way, this discussion about how doxa can be, you can move through doxa and yet be questioning the operation of distinctions of names, we can come to awakening of truth, awakening of knowledge, which is anageia. He says, I can't defend this with full confidence. The best I can do is say, as a lineup in this language, he just says faith, trust, pistis, and something to do that we are better and we are more courageous and we are not powerless if we choose this direction versus saying it's hopeless. The search is hopeless from the beginning. So Daniel, I'm thinking you have absolute choice. I'm thinking of that kind of language in the discussion. So I'm just saying this in the sense of bringing it back of this empathy aspect, because I'm thinking of notes from poetry, from Aristotle, that points to universals, histories of particulars. So the operations of history with fiction, Aristotle, I think, would very much point out that the higher reality is actually poetry. Because it's supposed to help draw out what you're pointing out, Daniel, which is how can you have understanding from things that you've not very experienced to? And the artistic encounter is one of those operations that you're supposed to do that. So I think that's actually a very reasonable and interesting, distinct point. And I think actually the big note is the big limit of people not being ignorance of dreams, right? This kind of sitting of that not realizing that we sit in ignorance of dreams and thinking that in the operation of science that has kind of domesticated logos and shunned off mythos to be this kind of operation of entertainment, of suspension of disbelief, neither not allowing them to cross, or better said, that's only like the kind of normie account of it, because any great scientist has been revealed to actually use imagery, metaphor, thought experiments. They're a sense of play. It's not calculation. It's not the logarithmia, basically the kind of logos which is of a calculation. It's actually play. Those use my cute language. I use Michelle and Javier, Geopedia. It's actually, this thing is actually a movement of play to actually generate drawing up distinction, activity of thought to try to draw out. And actually another note I'll draw from Aristotle on rhetoric is the whole purpose of this, using proportionate analogy, the way we're talking about it, is to bring before the eyes. This is literally, this is why I see in Aristotle all this systematic thought pointing to a way of into understanding, right? That kind of bring before the eyes with an anageia of this is that. That's the language he uses on it. To help draw out, and it's supposed to draw out the new understanding of this fifth term that leaped forth with a new apprehensional awakening of a new understanding. So I just want to share that, and I love you all.
Absolutely fantastic. I will give it to Christian. And as you were speaking on this leaping quality, it makes me think again of the phenomenology of the artist, because you're trying to come up with a story idea. You're looking around and, oh, that's it. Or you're in the hip hop cipher, the Jacob Kashir, and you're hearing and you hear the beat and you go, oh, that's it. And you boom, and you get it. Do you calculate that? Or is there just suddenly this bam, apprehension? I'm thinking, as I've described with the great Sam Greenerside, with her story, The Mermaid, on this moment of how there's the verbally processing to get all the data on the day to describe everything that occurred, and suddenly you apprehend the principle. And I associate this with Nabokov's Speak Memory, when he talks about see the sailor, and it's one of those pictures that have a bunch of little small pictures, and you walk around, and suddenly you see the big picture. Ah, there it is, right? Like one of those optical illusions. This operation of thought that is analogically suggested by Nabokov is one of my favorites, because I think we're doing this all the time. In conversation, we're putting a lot of data out, like those small little pictures, and suddenly you see the big picture they all make out, right? You hear a lot of information, and suddenly, boom, you get the principle, you get the form, you get the theme. It just kind of pops out, right? One of the reasons I think philosophy that doesn't do art or creativity can be in trouble is because it is not trained in the leaping principle. It is trained in the calculation. So it basically just tries to be AI. Also, this would be very loaded and take us in perhaps a different direction. I've been thinking a lot about how it is precisely limitation that creates incentive and reasons for human to learn analogical reasoning, and that if AI does not have those same limitations, it will not develop analogical reasoning. That the very limitations of human being is what creates incentives for these more energy efficient ways of determining principles via analogical reasoning, because if you had to calculate the principle, you'd be overwhelmed by the energy expense. Only AI can do that because it can calculate so much so quickly, but humans can't. So we have this kind of shortcut of being able to determine the principle that AI will have no incentive to create, because it has no limitation, actually, except using all the electrical grid and destroying everything. But anyway, so I'm more and more interested on how analogical reasoning actually follows from the very finitude of the human being, which then suggests this ability to boom, get it, boom, get it. Which again comes out in the hip hop cipher, comes out. And there is something to me about empathy where you're learning just to get how that person is, learning to just apprehend it, right? You're training that capacity. And that also is being used in, you know, as Katajan says, basically without analogy, you can't have metaphysics. And there's something about metaphysics that is the categories of thought that you apprehend in the experience of phenomenon that points beyond it, through which you understand those phenomenon, or else you're just stuck in infinite calculation, and there's all sorts of issues that arise from that. I think what you're getting at with Minnow, that Minnow paradox, is so important, and I will give it to Christian. But isn't it interesting that in the hip hop cipher, in the writing of the story, you do know when this is the right thing for the character to do. You do just know this is not believable for the character to do. You do just know that this design doesn't work. You do just know that, you know, this beat doesn't work. Isn't that freaking weird? You just know it. You don't have certainty, and you do. Certainty is impossible, but when you're writing that story, you're like, nah, Ibis would never do that. This isn't believable to be to do. This is. How do you know that? It has this leaping quality. It has this leaping that sort of comes out. It does suggest something about art. It does almost suggest, and then I'll give it to Christian here. You could argue it's like music. When you hear a note, you go, that's not right. Oh, that is right. And you apprehend it. It has this leaping quality. Well, reality itself might be this like music in this sense, actually, and that the capacities of analogy is learning to treat reality like music. And then I know Christian has been talking about consciousness, and I'll give it to him. There's an idea that consciousness is basically always trying to go to sleep in the energy saving way. It doesn't, it just wants to go to sleep, and you're actually conscious in those moments of the apprehension. That's when you're conscious, is in that leaping moment. And then this would suggest that fantasy, fiction, art is training us to be conscious, actually, because we're not even conscious if we're not capable of catching this glimmer and glimpse, engaging in this leap, and that the working of fiction, et cetera, so forth, is to train us to actually think. And then, of course, this would suggest that a society that removes fantasy in name of science is putting us to sleep. It is taking away this ability to think in terms of that of which is beyond our immediacy, that nevertheless we're searching to apprehend. And that would have to be expanded on, but I will stop and give it to Christian, and then if anyone else likes to speak today. Christian, it's good to see you, and I like your hat. You have a very cool hat. It looks like the one Reed was wearing earlier as I made them. They had to rake up grass because I'm a monster. And Reed really had a hat like that. But Christian, good to see you, sir.
Reed is one of your boys?
One of them. I just point randomly and hope it's that one. So that is, yes. Okay. That is the second oldest boy. Haven, Grace, Reed, and Paul. So
Haven,
he's
Grace, Reed, and Paul. Second eldest. Very good. Well, maybe one day I'll pass my hat down to
a gentleman.
To Reed.
Yes, sir.
Not a lot to share. Mostly just some little reference shares. I ran across this quote, which I'm sure a lot of people here have already heard before, because it's from Thoreau's Walden, which I've never read. Now I want to read it because I liked this quote. But it goes, not till we are lost do we find ourselves and realize where we are and the infinite extent of our relations. I was like, damn, dude. I saw the quote. I didn't know who it was at first. I looked it up. I was like, damn, Thoreau. Okay. I need to, maybe I need to read Walden, because that was like such a spot on quote. And it touches, I think, so much of what we often talk about mystery and flow and intelligence and you know, the openness to be, I mean, he uses this nice word lost, which I think is great, to kind of not know where you are. That's when you realize where you are, right? Because you've kind of gotten out of, you've stopped assuming that you know, and now you get to see, oh, I'm here. Anyways, I liked that quote a lot. And then I was going to make a book recommendation. I can't make it too strongly because it's been so long since I've read it, but it's always stuck in my mind. And it's Gary Snyder's, it was his college thesis, I believe, which got published. Hold on. I just looked it up because it's a long title. He Who Hunted Birds in His Father's Village, The Dimensions of a Haida Myth. And it's about a single myth that's told by a Native American tribe, or at least was, in the Pacific Northwest. And Snyder's thesis is about the dimensions of this myth and how those dimensions get revealed as the listeners, the people in the tribe, hear it as they grow older. But it's just, he paints this really interesting picture that just is burned into my head. So first of all, a family they have a long house, and there's a sleeping room, and the whole family sleeps in the sleeping room. And after the sun goes down and it's bedtime, that's when it's story time, right? Of course. So the whole family listens to these fables, myths, whatever, together, which I just thought is such first of all, such a nice thing. But then this idea that the this myth. And by the way, it's like, it's a like what you might imagine from a typical indigenous myth. It's there's no like characters with names and backstories. It's very archetypal. It's very symbolic. It's simple in certain ways, and involving like animal people and a fish that can talk, and it's there's an abstract quality to it, more than a realism to it. But there's like narrative, this and that and that. But just this idea that this kind of what seems like a very simple thing can well, I guess what impresses me about it is that this doesn't seem like something that's easy to sit down and write, even if you're an amazing writer. It seems to me like the kind of thing that evolves with a community or culture over time and probably gets amended over generations and slowly infused with its dimensions of meaning, such that on the one hand, a young child can relate to it in just a very playful way. It's just a story to capture their imagination and lull them to sleep. And then as you get older, there's more meaning, as maybe kind of something that helps you understand how to make your way through life. And then something deeper, more spiritual, more philosophical as you get older. But I just wish, I was like, man, this is like, should be an aspiration for artists and writers and creators today, is to create artifacts that have that depth of dimensionality. And I'm not saying anything new to bemoan the state of like children's films and Pixar and Disney and stuff, but it's like, it seems like the dimensional bandwidth of children's stories has gotten so thin. And it's like, when do we get back to like these rich, dimensionally loaded stories that, an old person gets something interesting from, a young kid gets something from, everyone gets something from. I aspire for our modern culture to regain that dimensionality of storytelling. But that's all I got for you.
Fantastic. That was a wonderful quote from Thoreau. I've run out of sticky notes. I'm using the back of receipts. We'll see how long that goes. There was a lot said that was extremely important. Yes, and what you're saying about children's stories, you can bemoan them all you like. It is no issue. Well, one of the things, we'll just on this theme of analogy, like one of the reasons why, say, the great religious texts or great literature, why do they stay with us? Is because they're analogical, because they keep unfolding and they're not context specific. That was a very important point that Jockin pointed out, where a metaphor has a deep context. Great literature is great literature and great art has analogy in operation. And that's why they just keep going. And one of the issues, and my beloved Wilson would talk about this all the time, is people didn't know artists were forgetting the difference between symbols, metaphors, and analogy. Like they thought symbols was, what like good. And Flannery O'Connor hated symbols. She was like, no, that actually removes the construction of, thematic work, analogical work. And you can see her short stories as masterpieces in analogical reasoning. And again, I think basically she is a very good example of what religious literature or religious art looks like, because every movement of the bull, every movement of the character is pointing to a theological principle that is lacking. Like that's another key, is that great art has a lack that it points to in all of its motions, that then creates room for the generations to think as they unfold. So there's an analogy going on. I think that I also wanted to comment on the dream state that Jockin was pointing out, on how the leaping occurs in the dream state. Yeah, I think that's right. When you're in the hip hop cipher and you're in a kind of dream state, things jump out. When you're really in the zone of writing, stuff jumps out. Like one of the beginnings of me being philosophically mystified was not knowing, like one day realizing as I was reading Redwall with the mouse and the sword and going, oh my gosh, I see a mouse with a sword in my head. How is that possible? I'm looking at black marks on paper and there's a movie in my head. That freaked me out. And that is a dream state. Like when you're reading and there's something playing in your head, you're in a dream state. In fact, when you're I think a lot of great thinking is thanks to daydreaming more than active thinking. We've talked about this before, not putting your fist on a rock. And it's when you're walking in the forest and then bam, something leaps out at you. The more you can be intentional about dream states, the more things leap out at you, right? And basically, if you have there's something about a society that still believes in dragons that might be better positioned to encourage dream states. That's possible. I'd have to think about that. One that doesn't believe in dragons may be less positioned to help people enter dream states because it's more about intentional thinking and showing intentional and doing quantifiable thinking, right? Well, if dreamlike states are where the leaping occurs, and the leaping is the analogical without which we're not really human, this is a problem. And it is very interesting that the phenomenology of the artist allows a dream state. And I guess the last thing, and then I'll give it to Luber and then Dimitri, and if anyone else has things to say, I think the dream state is also important because in the dream state, you let the analogy unfold. You don't stop it. You back off. Like the problem with calculation is you jump in and stop it before, and thus it's just a metaphor. Like there's something about an analogy that if you stop early, it's just a metaphor. It's just a description. But if you let it unfold entirely, then you can see how it's more than just that, right? And there's something about the dream state where you're turning off your conscious mind, you're less active, your calculation is paused, and that's why the thing can jump out. That's why you can get to the place where the thing can leap out, because you're holding yourself back while active. That's what's weird in the artistic act. It's not like a passive inaction, it's an active holding back that's kind of occurring. Like you're writing the sentences, but also paying attention to what Caddy's doing. He's like, no, that's not what Caddy would do. You're actively writing the sentences like Faulkner, but also holding yourself back. And I think ciphers do the same thing. You're actively listening, but also waiting for the right time, waiting for the right moment. There's an active holding back that's going on, which of course is analogically like the cloud in Dante that's covering God's grace. God's hiddenness is for your sake, so that you actually are not destroyed by it and can unveil. But I would pause and give it to Mr. Luber and Dimitri. Mr. Luber! Mr. Luber, are you getting a phone call now? Of course you are. That's how this works. Mr. Luber.
It does always work like that. I hate it. Irony, man. Wow. Okay, so it's interesting. Do we think of the human, like, generally speaking, do you think we think of this human being analogously? Like, do we understand the human being as such in this way? I feel like we don't at all. And the benefit to that is there's not really an exposition in things. Things just kind of fucking, like, it moves much faster in that way. But I wonder, basically accelerationism is coming to mind as basically not having analogy at the center of what it means to be a subject, and which affords accelerationism to even happen in the first place. Because, like, when you're thinking about the logic of analogy, there isn't particular content that is solidified yet. You're thinking partial object, you're thinking proto content, proto subject, whatever. In that sense, I'm thinking about, what if the world was the extreme, but in the other way? Like, that it's accelerationism, but in a different sense, it's everybody is too much in that expositional state where they're thinking about how to thematize content too much, basically. What would that look like? And then basically taking those imaginary scenarios, we're living one. We're starting, like, that's the funny, like, that's the crazy thing. We're living one. But I think the other way would probably be bad too, that I've never even thought of, honestly, Like, I haven't thought of what would that scenario look like for real. And then having that scenario in mind, and then the other scenario, thinking through those scenarios actually seems to be a good place to start thinking about the relationship between syllogism and analogy, basically. If we don't do that, then I don't think we can have a proper account of the mediation of the two. So with that said, because we don't think like that, or at least I'm speaking for me, and I'm projecting on everyone else. So sorry. Because we don't think like that, is it possible to move in that direction, or is it too late? And I think this is analogous to basically virtue, in the sense of there's a point where there is no return. You can't go back. And how to critique, how to judge that limit, and whether if we actually are experiencing that right now, where we're at a point of no return. And then if we are at a point of no return, and the next question, sorry, then if we are at a point of no return, what is the best thing that we can do? And that's a very crude way. That's a very crude question, but I think the question could be asked way better and penetrate that dimension way better. But I think about, Daniel, you saying like Nick Land is like really honest in a certain way, like he's like kind of taking, capital serious, and kind of saying, like, in a certain sense, the obvious in a certain way, where like other people are like in denial a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I asked a couple questions. If I'm definitely curious on what people think about that. I would say I can't see the horizon of what it's going to be like when AI takes everyone's jobs, let's say, or when I can't see the horizon for that. So there's no answer. There's no answer, but there's no answer per se. But it's almost like with virtue, at least, if you can't even see how to be virtuous anymore, it seems like that's like an indication that you're at the point of no return. So there is a certain sense where it's like, just to use my language, it's like the causer has already revealed itself, and we have already made a decision, and the trajectory of whether it's a comedy or tragedy is already underway. And if we're at the point of no return, we're basically saying it's a tragedy. And that would suck. That would really suck. But maybe it wouldn't. I don't know. I'll pass it off. I'll pass it off.
No, I think they're tremendous questions. I'll give it to Dimitri and Daniel if anyone has anything else to say. I mean, there are ways in which there's a point of no return in the sense of the existence of AI is here, and it's hard to imagine everyone waking up tomorrow and forgetting about it. Oh, what was that? Don't know. And the technology is forgotten. I mean, it could be like I don't know, a grand amnesia or something. But there's also the point of no return, as in there's a certain point where the habits of autonomous rationality are so great that it is impossible for a critical mass of people to move toward dialectical thinking or analogical reasoning to get out of the self-effacement that would follow from autonomous rationality. That there's those different questions. If we are at the point where it is no longer possible to change to a critical mass the habits of autonomous rationality, then we can't know it. So let's just keep going like we haven't. So why not? This is fun. We're having a good time. I still got tomatoes. But there's there's of course that possibility. If there wasn't, there wouldn't be incentive to do the work of the alternative, right? Now, what's very interesting too, and Clayton, it is good to see you. It makes me think of our talk last night on everyone. Mr. Castillo, thank you for coming by, sir. On analogical reasoning of different things. So, a syllogism, I suppose we can say, is that A equals B equals C, therefore A equals C. That would be syllogistic, and I would put that in the realm of calculation. Analogy would be the ability to see A, and out of A, you see in A, the experience of A, B, and C, and the unfolding of A into C, right? That it would all be apprehended within A, right? You would not need the calculation of A to B to C, right? That the logic of A, B, C would all be in A, right? You would apprehend it. The motion of A would actually be like B and like C, right? Like it is all you need to do. You don't even, you know C by simply knowing A, and it's very unfolding, right? So there's an apprehension that is occurring in A, right? So here's the question for the human being. Okay, so I'm of the opinion that AI works in terms of calculation. It does not use analogical reasoning, and actually one of the reasons it does not is because it's not limited in its rational capacities. It has no need to develop analogical reasoning capacities. It can be perfectly reasonable and it doesn't have to sleep. But because we have to sleep and we run out of energy, we have incentive to be able to see B and C in A, not thinking A equals B equals C. There is reason for us to learn this capacity to see in just A, B, and C, because we want to sleep and we have energy constraints, right? AI does not. So it's just going to be like A equals B equals C. No problem. I can do that just really, really quickly. So the question is the following. And that all has to be expanded on. I have a wonderful time with Clayton discussing that. Is there certain forms, I'm just going to say forms, that under no possible circumstance can actually arrive at, that under no circumstance can calculation arrive at? Like as Mr. Jockin is saying here, is there an E that calculation can never get at? If so, there are limits to what AI can do. And in fact, if there are E's, or these fifths, that only analogical reasoning can know, well, then there's something that humans can know that AI cannot know. Now, that would suggest that there are certain conclusions that can only be reached relative to certain methods, that there is method exclusionariness, you could say, right? That calculation, if you're only able to do calculation, then there are certain fifths, there are certain forms that cannot be apprehended, that can only be apprehended in analogy. If that is the case, then basically what AI would mean is that we get really freaking good at analogical reasoning, that we really work to the place that we are able to actually have things leap out at us, right? And to the question of a world in which there was just analogy and not calculation, as you're alluding to, Mr. Luber, there may be something to be said that that's not possible because analogy precisely arises from things that can alternatively be calculated if they are there, like phenomenon in reality, right? Like the conditions of calculation are the same conditions for analogy, right? Like, therefore, you can't have a possible world where you could carry out analogy and not calculation, because it is the same phenomenon that are going on, right? However, it is quite imaginable. It is also imaginable that people don't do analogy, just calculation, because analogy has this odd quality of needing to jump out, and you almost seemingly can't, well, it's this weird thing where you can't seem to will it. You just kind of get it. You just kind of apprehend it, where you can will calculation. So it seems quite believable that people would lose the condition of possibility for the training of analogy, and therefore it's forgetting, right? And losing it. And in that losing, not apprehend that anything was lost, right? Whereas if you, I mean, there's a sense in which AI might create incentive for us to basically work the human being to practically just do apprehension, because if AI can do all the calculation for us, there's really no reason for humans to do that. We're just going to really be good at engaging in apprehension, which then the question is, how do you train that, and what does that look like, and how do we do it? Well, I think spaces like this help, things like hip-hop, phenomenon to the artist, learning that leap out quality. And then, of course, that the funny thing about all this is that leaping thought is arguably way more efficient than AI calculation, because it leaps out, but where AI has to go through the calculation. So there's a funny way in which the very unlimitedness of AI may make it less efficient than human beings who learn these capacities, right? Which would be pretty funny, because we tend to associate the removal of limitation with the increase in efficiency. That may not be the case. And in fact, in complexity science, it's actually pruning principles that create complexity, right? It would be the kind of the negation, the energy constraints that creates incentive for more efficient ways to use the energy that generates new phenomenon, right? Well, that similar thing, the very lack of limitations in AI may hinder its capacity for emergence. But let me give it to Dimitri, Daniel, and then Christian. Dimitri, please.
Yes. Okay. So you mentioned art. Why do we do art? I think the general thing you said is right. Like, we do art because the world is not enough for us, right? So there's a positivization of the lack in art, right? There's a, like, we want another world in a way. So therefore art. And so, but that's one side, right? The lack and the art stemming from the lack and all of that. But I'm going to cite Ovid here. Not that I read Ovid, it's Harry Mulisch who has read Ovid and cites him. So anyway, so Ovid says that it was merely art, was hidden by the art, was occluded by the art. So this is the mischievous, the deceitful, maybe even the conceit of art. You have to be very careful of this, otherwise you turn into Josephine, like in Kafka's story. You know, you start peeping and squeaking, and then it's like you might think it's the most important thing out there, but once you don't exist, it's like people don't really care for it. Okay, so that's okay. I think that the whole l'art pour l'art thing, I think it's criticized a lot, and I think we should not do art for art. I think it's really a tragedy or a travesty for art. Don't do that. Don't do art for art. It's that art, as you said, Daniel, grounds in that lack, but then it's art is it deceives us, you know, in that because it brings forth that, like, it reconfigures the lack, it gives a different twist or bend to it, but it's all still there. But it's because it's all twisted up, you don't really see it, but you're beguiled by it, right? Enamored, maybe fascinated or fixated at the worst. I'm also super guilty of this. Like, whenever I find the right song, I'll just put it on replay and I'll just keep on listening to it over and over. I don't exclude myself from that. Some people call it autistic. I don't know. Maybe that is the case. I don't. So okay, this world is not enough, and then we have art, but then art for art is also not enough. So, you know, art is not enough. Art is not enough. I think that's why I do philosophy, because art is not enough, not enough for me. And Kafka knew this. Kafka knew this, but he was very critical of philosophers. He called them like Lufthunde, so it's like air hounds, or like sky dogs. But it's also because he was, I think, he didn't really meet like amateur philosophers who are the best philosophers. He mostly met like professional philosophers, or was reading that type of shit, which is of course like the worst a lot of times. So and then you also get the scientism and all of the problems of scientism, and then of like calculating yourself out of making a decision, which is what a lot of this type of scientism is about. So those are like air hounds, and they always say the same thing. They're always saying they're adding to the body of knowledge, and therefore they have to do just do this tiny specialized thing that nobody will actually care about, but still it's like adding to the body of knowledge. So it's like that's how it works, right? So anyway, so that's like, there's this paper that Mulisch wrote that's so relevant to the politics of today, but also art. And so art, that it was just mere art, was occluded by art itself. That is pretty ironical, isn't it? Because in a way, art, like, one of the beautiful things about Mulisch that I can completely agree with, is that we are immortal. That people like to lament that we are finite creatures, and that we are bound up in finitude. I know Heidegger was a fan of this type of things. You know, what was it, like, defined by death, being towards death. But in the Kierkegaardian, Hegelian, psychoanalytic, Mulischian realm, this is a fiction. This is a limit that has not known itself as a limit yet. and this is what art shows. Like, we are immortal beings, like whether we like it or not, and probably most of the time we don't like it, because it means we keep returning to the same place. That's kind of unbearable to us. But so where am I going with this ranting and raving? So the irony of irony. So things are ironic, right? In general, things turn out to be the opposite. It's like you want to say A, and oh shit, B just slipped out of my mouth, and I try to go back to A, and then I say also C, accidentally, and this type of stuff. So that's ironic. But then there's also the irony of irony, and this is the paper of Mulich. And so what is the irony of irony? The irony of irony is basically, I saw this beautiful interview with a guy, and he was talking about the problem of the left calling right-wing people fascist and stuff like this. And then he was like, yeah, cracking down is great, the dogs should bite the protesters. And then he said to his interlocutor, oh, isn't that so fascistic? And it's like, yeah, well, when you are like killing protesters just for the enjoyment of like hurting them, like that's kind of how I understand fascism to be. So the irony of irony is like you keep saying, no, it's not this, no, it's not this, and then saying, well, okay, the left is calling me a Nazi, the left is calling me a Nazi, but you know what? Then we are fucking Nazis. It's like, fuck you. And that's the irony of irony, right? Like you make jokes, and then you don't even distinguish between like reality and the jokes. And so but this irony of irony, that's also how I want to understand art, right? So art shows us how we are immortal. It's not just finitude. We can also laugh at ourselves. But the irony of art is that it mischievously occludes that it is merely art that does this. And so what's actually happening here? So when I'm writing a story, when we are writing things, what are we doing? Do we really want to say it to someone else? Well, a lot of times I just really want to know what it is that I am writing. So, but then it's like, I have to do this, right? It's hard work, but it's not me doing it, because it's like I have to let the narration and the story and the paper, I have to sacrifice myself for it to become what it is. I shouldn't go in the way of this, right? But then only I can do this. Only me can write it in that particular way that I would have written it. And so so there's like a space at this pavio. Like, literature is Christian atheism, because you're like, you are God, but you are not God. I think that's exactly right, and that's exactly what I'm pointing at. But also, I don't want to be completely merely patriarchal, because also we have to include motherhood, and we have to include matriarchy in this. You're not only a father, you're not only a father figure to your writing, but it's a birthing, right? But what is involved with birthing? I don't know the English word, but it's like those, I think, birth pangs, actually. Like, they can take for a very long time, right? Depending on the situation. And they hurt. Like, these birth pangs, they hurt so much. And you don't know, like, there's weird symptoms about how they all work. And we don't like to talk in like neurotic reality about like how birthing actually takes place, but it's quite of like, can be very disgusting, and of course it's beautiful. I'm not discounting that, but it's like, wow, like there's piss and there's shit, and it's like the baby is in the piss and the shit maybe, and it's like, fuck, is it like it's not moving, and like you have to slap it, and then it starts crying, and you're like, what the fuck? And then the woman is like to the child, like, why are you not listening to me? You know that I made you? And it's like, yeah, mom, you made me, but like, you didn't know that you made me. Like, you didn't make me, mom. Like, I didn't make the story that I made. It's like, I did it, but did I really do it? Well, I did it because I wanted to know what would come from it. And it's like the same thing with children. Like, it's like, yeah, my mom made me, and sometimes in my life she has actually used that argument, like, yeah, I made you. But it's like, no, yeah, well, you did, but you had you had no idea what you did. So yeah, that's for me the type of birthing process of writing too. You know, it's all the nastiness is involved. All the nastiness is involved with that, and so it's all unreal. It's like it's not there. It's just a fiction. But yeah, then some people actually do listen to it. They are curious about it, and in that sense, like it really happened. Like it really happened. Someone really read, and then you really have a conversation about it, and you're like, wow, I didn't know it was that real, but it turns out to be, and that's really beautiful. So yeah, with that, I don't think the world is not enough for us, but also art is not enough for us. That's my thesis.
No, I think that's very well put. I'll give it to Daniel and Christian. I think on that idea of art being this both, oh, I didn't know I was making you, but I was making you. It is a messy and beautiful process. Like birth denies categorization, which is precisely then, in a funny way, I think analogical potential is found in a denial of categorization that helps us actually find new categories. Like the very fact that birth doesn't fit neatly into a category actually is why birth analogically can be a place from which new thinking can happen. Because one of the great problems is we use categories too easily. Oh, it was nice. It was sad. It was beautiful. It was bad. Well, that lacks dialectical potential. It's when you say, well, birth is both like disgusting, beautiful, wonderful, hard, all at the same time. Well, this has dialectical potential. And I do think often analogy is found where there is vast dialectical potential. And that's where the loss of analogical thinking in our society has contributed to a loss of the dialectical thinking, and thus we get simplistic categories, totalization, and all of the political ramifications that come from that. And there is something about art where you know what you're doing, but you don't know what you're doing at the same time, and you have to think that. You have to think this, knowing what you're doing and not doing at the same time. Just a really quick comment, and then I'll give it to Daniel and Christian on what you were saying about the joke. Yeah, there's this danger. If you start making jokes that are xenophobic or racist, that's how it starts. And then it gets to being real, right? One of the differences, I think art tends to end up in the irony of ironies when it allows naming. Art that denies naming is less likely to do this because it forces you to wrestle with the contradictions and move in the direction of the analogy. It makes me think of Edie has a wonderful contribution to the Lacan anthology where she was talking about the name of the father and the danger of naming. And, you know, she's given presentations on the importance of poetry, right? The moment you name something, there's danger because it gives you power. You don't have to think anymore. You know what it is. This is the Korobowski identification, right? In my opinion, a lot of art that actually ends up permissionary in a bad way or propaganda or whatever allows naming. It allows you to say a thing clearly. Great art does not allow you to say that. It unveils a principle of intelligibility that denies you that naming, and therefore you have to tarry with it, right? Like, I think great religious texts do that as well. Just when you're about to say, well, this is the clear dogma, nope, you can't name it. You have to live it. You have to keep tarrying with it. You have to keep orbiting it. I think great philosophy does the same. It denies the name of the Father, if you will. So I think art, to stay in the proper way, the art for lack's sake versus art for art's sake, it requires analogy, and it has to deny naming. It has to deny you naming it or saying what it is. Well, in another way to put that, good art doesn't let you say what it means easily. Like, it doesn't allow you to say what it means. Like, what did the artist mean is one of the most destructive phrases to art. What was the meaning of the artist? No, 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 don't, no, no. The meaning is the entirety. The work of the artist is the analogical wrestling you have to do forever now. When you say, what was the meaning? There's no analogical wrestling. You're finished with it. There's no dialectical thinking. You're done, right? So the meaning, like this idea that poems are codes that have to be decoded to get the meaning has been the death of art. And because what you're saying is, what is the name of the art? Find the name. Find the meaning. What is the principle? Right? That, I think, leads to the irony of ironies that makes art actually destructive and very problematic and a slow, gradual permissionary to the problematic. But let me get, and also you were saying on the thinking, the creative female, Michelle does great work on that. Cleo Kearns also has a tremendous piece on thinking, maternity, etc., so forth. Very good. But let me give it to Daniel. Daniel, thank you for being here on this fine day, sir. It is wonderful to have you.
It's edifying and uplifting to be part of this conversation. I just on the naming, like a short one. Like I often think about just how self-contained like the name Jesus is, and it like gets lost when you like, okay, but what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Like, and it's like there's something like there's a Buddhist notion in Namarupa, like when the name and the form of the thing come together. I don't think you need that Buddhist notion for that idea. But there's something there. Just adding on to that theme of the artist not naming. But I was thinking of the other kind of axial age great Socrates and this idea that you brought up, Daniel, in terms of the holding yourself back in art. And I was like wondering, it often strikes me when I'm trying to think about Socrates that because it part of his maybe it's irony, but also the way that he gets teased or that it irritates people. he's he's like I really don't know what you're talking about, or like I don't know what I. But people think he's feigning this kind of ignorance. But if you really consider that he doesn't know what, but that's exactly the position that opens him to the capacity to walking the space that it is then revealed that he has to have had some kind of familiarity with this conceptual in order for him to like guide another person's understanding in that way or the argument in this way. But again and again in the dialogues, it's like he really doesn't know. So it's like it's this realization like if you have to hold yourself back in a way in order to do art. The image that I had then of Socrates is like that I just saw Dimitri's thing. I'm hysterical for real, please help. Yeah, it's like the the reality of maybe like a word like destitution or Christian brought that poem of being lost and finding yourself. And then just this the yeah, I guess that was also food for my soul today because I'm feeling lost and etc. But this like this just the position of Socrates, and then it's interesting because like I was thinking about that because it's also recorded that I think around the time of his death, he reports the kind of fantasy that he has to like he would have been a poet. I think he said or done music. He says something like this, just like on his deathbed. He's like, I would have enjoyed to be a poet or something like that. Um, and but then like I guess one of the ironies is that like the only reason we know that anecdote of this concrete historical character is because Plato created the art that he did. He wrote the dialogues, he did the things, and we can read about it, um, and then think back on this person and who he must have been. Um, I think. Yeah, it's there's definitely a lot of food for thought around this, like the syllogism analogy pairing, um, and then this notion of leaping and the function of leaping in doing art and in thinking, um, and because that I think Thomas brought that language in, um, and it strikes for me from the Republic where the philosophers distinguished in terms of how they relate to um, hypotheses. Like like the mathematician has the axioms that set up the geometric space, and then they kind of deduce. They work out from there. Actually, Daniel saying this is a I really relate to this distinction in your own thinking, I think. So the philosopher is different in that they and I'm only recently or I'm coming to a new understanding of this. Maybe there's like an analogical movement in my own thought. But the philosopher is distinguished because they're not moving deductively from pre-assumed ideas or first principles. They are trying to move toward, well, this is where it gets difficult to express. They're trying to move towards first principles, or they're moving from first principles, or like establish them, or like that space, which I've just pocketed in my thinking for now, like three years, and an analogical kind of shift is recently occurring, and it's having to do with like thinking about the subjective positioning of someone like Socrates. Like when he's like, I don't understand, he's really is in some kind of ignorance that is Parmenides is opening up the space of thought for me. It's like and I think this is where I'd modify this idea of leaping, or at least add maybe like if the artistic leaping is the progression in a kind of dreamlike narrative space, and there's this emergence within that. I'm playing with the idea that the leaping from the philosophical position operates somewhere like the matrix that Parmenides is laying out. And I think Lacan expresses something similar in terms of him pointing to Parmenides and saying like that matrix of if the one is, and then etc is what I'm mapping out in psychoanalysis. I'm getting this from Mladen Dolar's paper on the Parmenides. But okay, so that's that. Then like the leaping, it seems like it's never that anywhere new is got, but that there's this reiteration of certain ways in which the non-relation manifests itself. And then the philosopher's art, or the training that's laid out there in the Parmenides, is the training these different configurations maybe, or like now the leaping between hypotheses is not because something and I don't know if I'll like rest on this language, but it's like not because something new comes in, but because there's like a familiarity with that matrix. So I don't know what to say here, but this is what I'm thinking at the moment. So it's nice to be here in thought. But let me put it down there.
I think you're getting at a lot of important things. I'll give it to Christians, and then as we come on the close, if anyone has final things. So a way I would put it is, so there's always this problem in philosophy of presuppositions. Can you think without presupposition? There's some lovely comments in the chat as well, right? And there's this idea it's impossible to think without presuppositions. Well, if this is so, we have an issue, and I can't help but allude to the map is indestructible idea, because a world that is stuck in presuppositions is ultimately going to end up in what Joel Karini will call presuppositionalism, which is everyone's like, well, if you share our presuppositions, you share our worldview, and if you don't, well, there's nothing we can do, right? So what will happen is you'll have map proliferation, is what I will call it, where everyone will splinter into their different fundamental first principles. They'll create their own society. And basically, this is what occur. The likelihood of this is a bunch of small fascist states is what will occur, and that's where the world is going. As that develops, you will probably have then a global reaction against it, which will be a massive centralization like a global state. In response to that, you will have more map proliferation back and forth, on, as people are trying to deal with the existential stability that results from the encounter of otherness that does not share your presuppositions. So it is very important to ask the question, is presuppositionalism all we can hope for? Is that it? Well, it sounds kind of absurd to suggest that non-presuppositional thinking is possible. How is that even freaking possible, right? Well, something I talked about that I'll bring in that I think is relevant here is intersuppositional thinking, which is thinking that emerges in the encounter of worldviews, the surprise, the hip-hop cipher, this thought that emerges in the metaxis, as William Desmond will talk about, right? Well, this is what's very interesting. I would argue that the thought that occurs in the metaxis is basically almost always, apprehension and analogical, not calculation. And what's very interesting about this is thought that strikes you as actual, even though it doesn't have presuppositions, even though it is outside your presuppositions. You have an encounter with something actual that is not reducible to presuppositions, that has the authority of that which is justified. And this is interesting. It has a certain authority to it, just like beauty. You don't know what it is, but it says you must change your life. Like there's an authority to beauty in the strike of beauty, right? But it's not a presuppositional authority. Like the authority of presuppositions is, okay, this follows from this follows from this. Therefore, you must, if you are internally consistent and you are intellectually coherent, you will follow the syllogism. You will follow the internal consistency, right? But in beauty, Nah, you just got to change. There's an encounter that surprises and you apprehend something. It's like the character must do this in the story. The hip hop cipher must say this, right? The intersuppositional space is where it seems to be possible for, now I'd have to expand on this. It is the possibility of apprehension and analogy in the intersuppositional space, the between space, which is also a space of lack, of course, because there's a present absent, like what is a between space? It's defined by a certain lack characteristic. This seems to be where we can find thought that addresses the problem of presuppositionism that if we don't address, we're going to end up in a world with a whole lot of small fascist states, of people bound to their individual story that are not able to relate with otherness. So I do think this capacity of apprehension found in the intersuppositional is suggesting how we can deal with the problem of presuppositional thinking. But here's the weird thing. The moment you think about it, you can deconstruct it. Here's the problem. Any thought that you arrive at in the intersuppositional space, if you try to calculate it, that's what reasoning gets the barbaricism of refinement, as Vico says. You can always deconstruct it. You can always, reason creates nihilism, because you can always say, well, where's your presuppositions? They're not there, okay? Because do you know what the justification is? The experience itself. The experience itself becomes the justification, not axioms. And to say that everything real can be brought to axioms would only be true if algebra was more real than geometry. But if geometry is discovered and algebra is created, it's a low resolution of geometry, then the truest things are actually experiential, not axiomatic. The justification is ultimately in the experience and apprehension of the geometry, of which unveils itself in the intersuppositional in terms of the quality of the geopadic and the beautiful. I think this is very important to think, because I do think the ability to basically train apprehension is strongly tied to the question of addressing global pluralism in a manner that doesn't end up in some form of horror, totalitarianism, fascism, etc. So, but let me pause, skip to Christian, and then Mr. Jockin and Kate. Mr. Christian.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. You said some stuff that's got me thinking. Maybe those thoughts will complete themselves while I say the other things that I was going to say. So Daniel brought up something that it's not. It's just a little thing that I don't take so seriously, but I think about it, and I've thought differently about it recently, which is the question of Socrates and whether or not he was what they called an iron, someone who is like, whether he was being ironic, but in that context, iron meant like an actor, someone who's not being sincere, basically. And before I read more Socrates, I kind of assumed he was not an iron. And now the more that I'm reading him, the more I'm like, I think Socrates might have been a troll. I think he was fucking with people, and he was like being like at a certain level. I think he was playing that game where maybe superficially he was being sincere in that he was technically representing himself accurately from one perspective, but that there was also a layer of insincerity where there was something not being spoken intentionally so as to create an effect that misrepresents what's actually happening within Socrates to his interlocutor, basically making himself seem more naive than he actually is, even though he sincerely, technically speaking, might have grounds upon which to argue whatever the situation is, right? Like, what you're saying doesn't make sense, or I don't know X, Y, or Z. That might be technically true, but Socrates also knows that the interlocutor was trying to like kind of say this, and he's making it seem as if he doesn't know what the other one's trying to say, blah, 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 for effect. I mean, who knows? But it was just funny the other day that my intuition there got changed. And also, I don't know if I can share it. I don't think I can. I made an image of the classical bust of Socrates, but with the classic troll face, like the big teeth smile. I'm like, I don't know, maybe I just got to lean into the idea of Socrates, the troll, the meta troll. But you know, after like some kind of like funny resistance to this idea, I think because I don't know. I just maybe had some associations with Socrates as like with like purity or something like this, and that well, I'm like he couldn't have been like truly. No, he was being sincere. Um, and then I remembered, hey, my like one of my top five favorite books of all time is Trickster Makes This World. And I'm like, yeah, why can't Socrates have some of the archetypal trickster in him? That's actually makes a lot of sense to me now that I think about it. Because I, well, first of all, if you haven't read that book by Lewis Hyde, it's really, really, really good. It's one of the most common recommendations I ever make to people is Trickster Makes This World. But it just goes through in many different historical, cultural, anthropological, mythological contexts and modern contexts. I mean, everything from like ancient indigenous myths to games people would play to Frederick Douglass to modern art and John Cage. It just like ties together this theme and is an incredible writer. But anyways, I'm like, yeah, okay, Socrates, maybe he was a little bit of a trickster. That's cool. But the thesis that you have to break stuff in order to fix stuff is one of the things that's always most compelling to me. And I'm like, yeah, I see that in Socrates. He was breaking people a little bit. He was kind of forcing their position, so to speak, with these kind of naive questions to lead them to a point where their logical, their like chain of rationality suddenly hits a dead end, right? And in that breaking, you create space for something new to happen. And that interestingly, and this also is in that book, comes back to the subject of art. And art as like a joint. So like arthritis, right? It's because there's like a common root in the Latin or the Greek or whatever, I can't remember. But anyways, he makes the case for art as like the place where we form joints so that we have motion. So whereas previously something was fixed and stiff, we have to break it so that now we have flexibility, because we need that flexibility because otherwise we run into XYZ problems. So like art as this breaking process is really interesting. With AI, it's fun, as you were talking about your conversation with Clayton, I recalled an article that just popped up on my feed yesterday. And I'm not in any position to talk about the like kind of deep realities of what the hell's going on with the state of AI, but what it made me think was similar to what you're saying. I was like, anyways, I'll just read this quote from an AI researcher who says that him and his team are trying to add like a vertical dimensionality to AI processing. It says, one misconception is that our perspective merely proposes more complexity. Our goal is structured complexity, adding dimensions and dynamics that reflect how intelligence arises in nature and works logically, not just stacking more layers or parameters. For AI, this could mean a system shifting from vague or uncertain outputs to coherent ones as it gathers more context. These transitions can mark a point where AI truly understands a task or pattern, much like human intuition kicking in. And so like it's this interesting question of like what can an AI do, or better put, what can a human do that an AI cannot do? And I'm like, I you can mark me down as someone who's got concerns about AI, and also has thoughts about the limitations of AI. But I also am like pretty open in terms of like what I think it will be able to do. And I think it's a very theoretical field necessarily, because human cognition and intelligence is a very theoretical field. So we're really like kind of playing around with a lot of guesswork. But I would imagine that there's the only thing that might ultimately prevent an AI from doing exactly what a human mind does is consciousness. And yes, I've been talking about consciousness lately because I've been thinking about it lately. My 10,000 word essay is due in 7 days from now. And that's why I think I mentioned some of this the last time I was here. I'm so interested in the question of like, is there evidence for like bilateral causality between the physical system and our conscious phenomenological experience? But yeah, I run into people who on Substack a lot, although I'm just not even using that platform so much these days because I'm not my best self on Substack. So I'm like, I'm just gonna stop scrolling through the death feed. But what I was seeing a lot of was a lot of knee-jerky reductionism, reductivity of what AI can do. And I think that really misses the boat. I think you should probably assume that AI can do the wildest things that you can imagine it can do. And just let that shift the goalpost to where it needs to be when we ask what's the difference between AI and human intelligence, right? This is really important ethically because to the extent that our ethics are grounded in our idea of consciousness, the felt sense of pain, suffering, etc. If you could, Orko R theory, Penrose Hammerhoff, their work is kind of having a revival right now with deep research that might maybe there is like a kind of quantum aspect to how the brain works and microtubules and all that stuff. It's being taken a lot more seriously. If we not I don't think we can ever explain the mystery of consciousness, but if we can determine to some extent, okay, this is like the interface between the brain and consciousness. Maybe it's in these microtubules, maybe it's in entangled quantum states of particles, whatever it might be. Then, you could unlock the ability to make AI conscious potentially, right? And that just opens up so many fucking ethical dilemmas. It's just like, to me, like people always talk about what AI might do to us. I'm like, what tortured consciousness might you be bringing into the fucking world? Like, imagine if you could make your lamp conscious or I don't know, your rug. What I'm being playful here, but like, I think certainly we should be concerned that humans are always going to like push things to the limit. Anyways, me a bit rambling because I've been thinking about that stuff a lot lately. The last thing is this idea of presuppositions. And I would love, this is not the time because we're wrapping up, but I would love to hear more of your thoughts, Daniel, about how you your concerns about people's differences of presuppositions, and we can't work that out, and we're going to have whatever kind of catastrophic or undesirable governance arise from that. And I just wanted to mention that a couple days ago, I got invited by ASU to give a talk at their annual water conversations thing. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, but I'm a journalist, and that I'm a bit of a water policy activist, but I'm also a journalist, and so they invited me, as a journalist to come and give a presentation. And it's run by the humanities department, so philosophy, art, it's like a wide, big umbrella. So I'm like, I can talk about whatever I want, probably. You could kind of justify anything in the humanities. But one of the things I was like going through my head last night and spent quite a bit of time on was exactly this point, using water policy as this really complex, sticky issue to introduce the idea of how important it is that we need to start creating spaces and kind of like social technologies so that people with very different presuppositions among many different dimensions. That's from the language, what a word means, to your ethics, to your perspectives, and all of that. To be able to come together and talk and share and build collaborative understandings of what the hell is going on. And the kind of silver lining about working with water issues is that, I mean, all issues are super consequential, but the water is like a little bit unique in that it's extremely important. It's universally important. It's bipartisanly important. It's a little bit complex. So there's also this shared, like, we don't really understand what's going on with water. And so I am hoping it's an opportunity to plant a few little seeds of creating those kinds of spaces. And there's some work that I've done down here and that they did up in Phoenix that is trying to build these like more bipartisan spaces. It didn't work so well at the Capitol, worked better down here. But because it's just like whatever, humans, we tend not to break out of our patterns until it's demanded of us. Like, it's an emergency, and water is an emergency, and everyone knows it's an emergency with the Colorado and all of this and groundwater. And anyway, so I'm hoping water will be a kind of like political salve that can do the thing that other issues don't do, which is bring people together, and that then hopefully might be the basis to create some frameworks of future interactions by which or through which we can then address other issues. And I'll end by saying something that I never forgot from my 10th grade oceanography class, which is that water is the universal solvent. Water dissolves more substances than any other substance, more than like an acid, for instance, which is interesting. So look it up. Yeah, it's true. Water is the universal solvent. So I always come back to that in my mind lately, like maybe water is really the universal solvent. Maybe it can help us solve some of these really big cultural problems we have. Anyways, great chatting today.
Well, thank you for being here. Magnificent. I'll give it to Jockin and Kate. And, a few things. First, I think there is a quality in Socrates that has a bit of the quote unquote trickster, the ironist, the literary thinker, et cetera, so forth, because I think Socrates is denying affirmation. He won't give affirmation. And one of the reasons why is because often our hunger for affirmation gets in the way of the development of our capacity to apprehend. And actually, we see that all the time. People are looking for they want affirmation. Apprehension is that thought that leaps out to you that you feel affirmed in. The thought itself gives you affirmation. We look for affirmation when we have thoughts or ideas that we're not certain about, and we want someone to say, yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. But if we give in to the temptation for affirmation, we don't develop the capacity to apprehend. And there's something about Socrates that is denying affirmation for your sake, for the development of a certain capacity. I think I often think about. I will say also that on this idea of presuppositions, we must have presuppositions. We must be in maps. Maps are indestructible is what I call them. The question is, what do we focus on in the map that opens up universality in our singularity? For me, it is the Gödel point. It's the point where maps unveil their essential incompleteness following Kurt Gödel, which is found in experience. And also it kind of, it becomes something that every map must consist of. No presuppositions can necessarily prove that they correspond with reality. And that very inability becomes that of which people focus on in their map, as opposed to the consistency of the map, which creates a bit of uncertainty that makes openness for the other, and the focus on the metaxis between maps and the possible experiences that can happen there, which I think is primarily categorized by beauty, as we talk about, and I think this is very important. I think also, to the last thing I will say on this idea that we should let AI do all of the wild thing that it does. So here's the kind of the hope for the human beings. If indeed we have this analogical thinking that is so important, whatever wild thing AI does, we will be able to analogically reason about, find a principle that might be able to inspire us to do things AI has not done yet. In the same way that if there's something about creating fiction that actually allows us to engage in analogical reasoning that without that fiction we would not do unless our immediacy gave us those things, which the chances of that are very low. AI could just be an engine of creating a whole bunch of things that inspire analogical reasoning that otherwise would not occur, that emerges from the reflexivity on the wild things that AI does, that AI would have to be programmed to reflect on the wild thing that it does and draw out that principle. Maybe it can do that, maybe it cannot, but there's nothing, let's put it this way, there's nothing that AI could do that would not be potentially analogically rich. And if analogical thinking actually inspires creativity, imagination, and new ideas, then this might actually, as a combination, be quite the engine of creative possibility. And that's where belief in dragons, the loss of belief in dragons could perhaps be compensated by the wild things AI could do that inspire thinking that otherwise could not occur. Hard to say, but that's something that's possible. But let me pass it on here. And again, thank you all for being here today. Mr. Jockin, Kate, please.
I think the major area I want to circle back on is what Plato's response was with using Socrates in Meno at the end, where he comments, hey, listen, I can't even justify this. Because remember, by the way, actually for Meno, that whole argument was to prove the immortality of the soul. So actually what's very important here, he's saying, how can you come to understand something that you don't have understanding of? The answer is because the soul already exists with eternal memory. That you're not learning, you're recollecting. And then this reveals the whole argument. So what he's doing in there is saying, my first principle is psyche, soul, eternal soul. That's my first principle. And then he says, even if you disagree with me about it, he then moves into a very pragmatic stance to say, it makes us better, makes us braver, and more equipped to address. So I'm bringing this up that you see there are two standards, two modes of working with first principles and working towards, right? Which Aristotle talks about. So there's a difference in this positional state of how you treat your first principles. One is, I need this to get off the ground, right? So the answer that's his pragmatic stance, but that's my reading of what Socrates is presenting, that character. He's saying, we're better if we do that, have this position, than saying, nope, there's no hope. Now, even if that's not true, it just makes us better pragmatically. It's better to do. But then he also says, but what I need to use this actually to get this off the ground, it actually proves at the start the first principle we're working towards, which for him is the eternal soul. He uses that because that comes from theology. There's a theological account that's being brought up there. But he's saying that this is given to me, that first principle of eternal soul, and this has to explain why we can know something. And I use it, and actually what's interesting, he says, and this is actually very important, related to AI, it's that power of demonstration. Demonstration is an enactment. It is not a word act. That's actually very important. In the sense that knowledge has to produce an enactment of demonstration. It cannot be just a word play, and by the validity of the syllogistic logic, that it's valid. That's not enough. That's where this kind of language of sound presentation comes in. The soundness, which has a lot of health, actually it's used for health a lot of times. Health and sound are actually used a lot in Greek for Plato. The necessity of the soundness of knowledge, it requires demonstrational experience, presentation. It cannot be just a word act. It's not solid. So my point is that he's showing by the demonstration of the slave boy of geometric demonstration via questioning only and presentations of names at certain times. So notice that he can't get the slave boy cannot complete his line of understanding until he got told the name of the diagonal, which was given to him, right? It points to your argument, Daniel, of the map incomplete, the incompletion of the map. There are certain incompletion of the map, and names need to be presented to help give you moving forward. I'm saying that because we do it all the time right now. What's consciousness? It's something it's a principle we work with, right? That's already pre-given. How do we talk about beauty in this group? Same exact thing. And actually, that argument actually works exactly, in my opinion, what Plato is doing in Meno. Why? Because we say we have a certain circumstance of our lives. If we presume beauty exists the way that we're talking about beauty, that in this rough schematic of what beauty is, it exists. We would be better people, we would have better lives and a better experience if we took this as true. Then, in the pursuit of it, we're going to actually encounter more understanding about it. At least I found that case as we work through. So just like what Plato's doing with the immortality of the soul as a given to justify how can we know things without actually having it, I see us in beauty doing exactly the same move. And we do it, and we still do it today because we do it with consciousness. What is consciousness? No one knows what it is, yet we presume it exists. That's because we accept that there are certain accounts that cannot be answered if we dismiss them. If we just said there is no consciousness, then things can't be accounted for. So that's because that's I say this also because of things like, and we're doing this in this group. If you notice here, we're in this group. I've noticed we do a lot of play with concepts, meaning the way we use surprise from information theory and cybernetics is not how surprise is understood by people in cybernetics. I say this because I'm in a course for that, and I could see immediately. You know why? Because see, we're looking for more surprise, the beneficial surprise, the revealing, leaping surprise. If you look at the literature, and again, I appreciate Insight Seminars course in it. I appreciate it because it points out, no, that the whole operation of cybernetics is the opposite. Get rid of surprise, minimize it. This is a thing to be optimized away. That's so we're using those concepts and those understandings and looking at it a completely different way. Because we're trying to draw out a different quality. Why? Because we have a presuppositional first principle of beauty, at least within my understanding. Another one would be, for example, anageia. That's one I use. Actually, one of my first principles is the concept of anageia from Aristotle, particularly. So by using that, I then build up from that line of argument. And then also, by the way, we see this in other fields, like parsimony. That's a first principle to say what's more the more parsimonious a concept is or explanation is, the better it is. Where's that coming from? That's the first principle. You're saying simplicity is better. You can justify by saying it's less fragile. But then there you go. Now you just got an argument of fragility as your first principle. So you're always building the bridge as you're walking through the bridge, like as you're walking forward. That's just how this goes. And I find that great philosophy tends to acknowledge that and work with that, versus saying, nope, here's our parameterization, and now we're going to calculate within that boundedness. It's a very different, as I had a note, I think it's very important. One translation of episteme is acquaintance with. It's very intimate. It is not a kind of distancing far away calculational disposition. Disposition is way more erotic. It's eros. And in the language of eros is it's the inner flux of the boundary of the within and without. And it's kind of this intimacy of, as you said, Daniel, facts become truth when there's love. And more particularly when there's a revealing activity and demonstration of moving towards your beloved. So I find that those kinds of thrusts, closing out with this, with Plato actually, I think it was me reminded Timaeus. So I couldn't find the exact citation quickly on the midwife conversation. Like that's what Socrates is doing. He's a midwife for thought, to draw out, to reveal. But there was a note related to it I found very quickly, Timaeus bit 155a. The uninitiated are those who only understand what they see and grab with their own hands, and they deny the existence of actions and generation and all that is invisible. So what I'm getting at here is that the understanding of activity coming to be, all the things that are, it was interesting because we would normally think those are seen, but those are actually unseen. Because it's true. It's actually a kind of Hume point. It's like, how do you don't actually see the connection between the two. So that's actually what Plato is pointing out there. It's very interesting. And by the way, the only way to understand that is an analogical understanding of being to substance, to activity, to quality, all this boundedness together. It's kind of this dance, the kind of encircling dance of seeing the movement of our maps and our images. Because by the way, Dimitri left, but just to close on, I'll close on this kind of, what's the danger of the images? That you can be wrong. But yet, nevertheless, we have to work through images. Because the key is actually to, in your intimacy, actually being able to trust that you can see the difference, that you see different, that the thing. So that's the key. Generally, actually, that's very interesting. So actually, the big thing is seeing difference. If you try to obscure the difference, hide away the difference, it's usually a very key indicator you're in trouble. Just like it's actually puppy. Very cute. It's like when you fall in love with someone, it's puppy love.
Yeah.
You can't see any flaws. No, doesn't exist. Any lacking qualities or anything that's different, you're like, nope. Complete satisfaction, my desire. This is kind of fun talking like this with you in the room. But real intimacy actually is the full awareness of the difference, of the lack, of the privation, of you're not. Yeah, you annoy me. Yeah, you smell a little bit sometimes. It's okay. Just you're human. But yet, nevertheless, and actually the thing is also in real love, the kind of captured love of puppy love, that kind of mimetic copying, only gets you exactly what you image. Gives you exactly, you get what you image, and that's what end result. But in the true kind of love that we're talking about, this kind of understanding of philia, right? Real divine, that kind of divine love. There's a new beginning, a new generation coming to be. Something leaping comes new that wasn't there before. Very fun. So, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I was just thinking about the fantasy ideas,
Well, go
about
for
the
it.
fiction books and other things. Basically, I was thinking about fiction as a teaching tool, because a lot of times we are recommending people to read classics, to read old anxious books, because they teach you how to live much better, and they actually teach you analogical thinking, as Daniel mentioned, and it kind of develops your fantasy and imagination, creativity. And what I was thinking about is that fiction and the quality of fiction is actually important for kids and the school system, because when we are giving to the people a very good quality of fiction, the old classics to read and analyze, we're teaching them, we kind of walk them through experience of certain characters, because there is different characters. There can be evil and good characters, and they can see from different perspectives how they see the life. And since our brains sometimes don't actually understand if we are in a virtual world or a real world, when we are reading the books, we can kind of feel all of the same things that characters are feeling. And that's why we kind of live through this experience, and we learn how to respond to similar situations in real life, even
In our lives now.
Yeah, in our lives now.
So not just a duplication of what happened in the past, but
Yeah.
a response to something new.
Yeah, this is what I was thinking about.
I think that absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Kay. I mean, what I'm also thinking, as you're pointing out with that, which is so important, is that you're able to feel something that someone else is feeling that is not bound to just in a mere ego. Like you're able to feel sadness when someone other than you is feeling sadness, or to feel happiness when someone other than you is feeling happiness. If you can't do this, friendship is not possible. And we talk all the time where there's something about beauty and friendship that are strongly tied together. Philosophical friendship seems to be very important for us to think our moment. And if you don't develop that, with fiction seems, well, fiction seems to play a necessary role to train one or get one to the place where you can do that with another person, actually. Like, because it's almost like if you go straight into doing it with another person, say beyond your family, it's too direct too soon. Because there's always this logic, like, I think often humans learn indirectly. Because if we learn too directly, it overwhelms us, or we get nervous. Fiction gives you a chance to almost practice emotion, practice getting an analogical reasoning, practice with the other person. And once you are so practiced, you can bring it to other people. If you never do that, well, then you can't bring it to other people. And this becomes very problematic. Instead, social relations, well, I think today we see many people's social relations are mostly strategy, not empathy. Most social relations today are matters of strategy, not empathy. People don't really feel one another. They just know the strategy of how to carry themselves in social relation. And there's almost games that are being played, which is, of course, not beautiful. It's just, it has this sort of, what is the best thing to say that the person's going to think you're cool. There's a kind of strategy that goes on. Whereas when you're in the mode of empathy or apprehension, it's more like a dance, which I think alludes to what Mr. Jockin was saying. And the other thing I guess I was thinking about is the difference between, what's the difference between bad literature and good literature? Well, I think it's kind of like that puppy dog point, right? Like bad propaganda literature and art is like puppy dog law. There's no flaws or anything. Whereas great literature, the good characters have flaws. Like Alyosha Fails with Ratnik, I go to the Brothers Karamazov. Like great literature does not have puppy dog characters per se. And if they do, then it feels like propaganda, or it feels like one of those books you buy at the back of the drugstore that you're embarrassed to be seen in public reading or something. So that's quite a problem. So there's something actually about imperfection that creates reality, which is odd because there should be a sense where imperfection is less real, but actually there's something about imperfection that's more real, which doesn't make sense unless the highest principle is not the good, but the beautiful, and imperfection actually is the principle of lack that points beyond the thing, that opens up analytical reasoning. Like, again, there's a sense in which if things were perfect, you wouldn't need analogy because they would be complete, right? Perfection and completeness goes together, which therefore imperfection is precisely the condition of possibility for this moving to higher principles through analogous reasoning, ergo beauty. If we were perfect, we could be good to one another, but not beautiful. And that would seem like a good world, but it would not be the best of all possible worlds. And I think that very imperfection that we see in great works actually are where the literature points to the beautiful. Now, of course, the beautiful entails the good and the true, like concentric circles. But the problem is if we sacrifice in the name of perfection, if we lose the conditions that point to lack to make the beautiful, we've made a mistake. And I think what Jockin was saying on duplication is very true. As some closing thoughts before we go, what you were saying on demonstration is very important. Oh, before I forget too, we were talking about this metaxic space, this space between people where you don't have a presupposition, but I think this point of from to presuppositions is very important. But generally the metaxis is defined by different presuppositions. Well, what would have to hold that together? Trust. And you could say trust is what society, like without trust, society is doomed. Perhaps one of the reasons why our society has lost trust is because we've been overly dependent on presuppositions to justify as opposed to trusting. Because there's a way in which if you're not careful in how you relate to your presuppositions, they remove from you the need to learn trust. And I think something like water can force it because we'll die if we don't. But it would be nice if we had a world where people learn to trust one another, not because they're going to die if they don't, but because they actually, it has affordances if they trust that are beautiful, that otherwise would not be there. So there's something about training trust. I think also this idea of the eternity of the soul, the surprise, et cetera, so forth in this presupposition issue. We must have presuppositions, but are we thinking to preserve the presuppositions or from the presuppositions, like in order to interact with people? Also, what you have said about demonstration kind of being the highest, right? It's better than a logical argument. I demonstrate it to you, right? I think what happens in the creative act is you have an experience that is demonstrated to you. This character came alive mysteriously in the hip hop cipher. You experienced. Words came from nowhere. In love, this beauty emerged. You've had things demonstrated to you by reality itself that you know are there, and you're trying to figure, you're like, what was that? And you're trying to name it. But of course, here's the issue. We have to name what has been demonstrated to us in order to, one, share it or to kind of keep a hold on it, but naming always threatens demonstration. Because once you name it, you feel like you have it. So we have to learn the skill of being able to name things that have been demonstrated to us in a manner that helps us preserve the demonstration as opposed to replace the demonstration. So for example, I like to call this the phenomenology of the artist. I have to be careful to talk about the phenomenology of an artist that removes the need to experience the creative act yourself. And thus phenomenology of the artist has to be used in a manner to point back to the demonstration, to go back to the experience, et cetera, so forth. Likewise, we have to name art or geopedic, et cetera, so forth in a manner that preserves the demonstration and shares the demonstration as opposed to replace it. We have to be able to name without losing. But of course, this is of course the classic theological problem. How do you talk about God without creating an idol? Because the moment you talk about God, you're at risk of idolatry. But if you don't talk about God, then you have no social intelligibility and you lose God. right? If you don't talk about God, you lose God. But if you talk about God, you could create idolatry. What do we do? Well, my beloved Austin Ferris said, get really freaking good at analogical reasoning, because that's the only way to think together Aquinas and Karl Barth. Now, that has to be elaborated on, and I like big cans of worm when it's time to go, but analogical reasoning is absolutely part of this problem. But similarly, so it goes with the issue of presuppositions. We require presuppositions. We need to relate to them in a manner that preserves what I call the Gödel point. The point that unveils our maps don't equal the territory. We use our maps to preserve the place where we experience the map is not the territory, because that is where, in my opinion, higher things can be demonstrated, like beauty, friendship, metaxis, cipher, etc., so forth. So this is the difference. In my opinion, for most of history, people have used presuppositions in maps to defend maps, to say that the maps equal the territory and that all other maps are stupid. Whatever, capitalism is the best, all other maps, all other economic systems are stupid, and I'm going to find all of the arguments to prove my map, my understanding of the world, and disprove everyone else. Most people have used their maps for that reason. What we need to do is use our maps to really, really know our map, precisely to find the point where it fails. And the only way to find where it fails is to really know it. But the reason you're finding it's failing is not to deconstruct it, but because a failure point after Kurt Gödel is structurally part of the map. The point where it fails actually doesn't destroy it. This is the mistake of deconstruction. Deconstruction tried to deal with the problem of difference by saying everyone's worldview is incomplete and wrong and will destroy maps, and everyone will then have peace because we'll overcome ideology. This is a massive mistake. Maps are indestructible. Ideology is indestructible. You destroy it, people go crazy, and they turn to fascism, strong men, etc., so forth. Maps are indestructible. Presuppositions are indestructible. The question is how we use them. The issue is we must use our maps to find the point of necessary incompleteness and have that be the commonality with everyone else. That can then be the bonds of a relationship that's intelligible to us, that is defined by the unexpected, of which we have faith in because of experiences that have been demonstrated to us that are beautiful, creative, and actually life-giving, that is only found in the unnamed space. That is only found in the spaces where our preset ideas do not apply. Which is, of course, terrifying, but there's a long tradition in theology where the only place to encounter God is to go through something terrifying. God is actually kind of supposed to be terrifying before you see the beauty, before you rise up to virtue, before you do the bath, because it's precisely the very goodness and glory of God that's terrifying for those in sin, right? Because it calls us out. There's always a judgment in beauty. But that very judgment, that very difficulty is the necessary precondition to face and rise to the occasion of, to be able to reside in the quote-unquote Gödel point by which new possibilities of global pluralism, interaction, etc., so forth is possible. It is a tall order, but I think it is indeed possible, and I enjoy the chance to meet with all of you wonderful people to better practice and exercise it. So thank you, Kate. Thank you for being here. Jockin, Daniel, Christian, it's been a complete delight. Reed may have overheard that he's going to get your hat, Christian. So be prepared to get a letter in the mail that said 10 years ago, on July 24th, 2025, you said you would give me the hat. The order is due, and you look and the door opens and Reed is standing there. He hasn't aged at all. He'll still be in his 5-year-old body, and he'll just be standing there waiting for his hat. So it'll be fantastic. But everyone, thank you for your time today. It's been a delight. All the best.